Judy, it looks like we've got all the council members here, plus Roy and Denise. Do you want to go ahead and call the roll, please?
Sure.
Well, let me first call this to order. We'll call this meeting of the Manchester Springs City Council for July the 14th, a work session. We'll call to order. You'll please call the roll now.
Sure. Council members: Judith Chandler.
Present.
John Cheda.
Here.
Julie Wolf.
Here.
Thank you. Susan Wolbrook.
Here.
Steve Brimner.
Here.
Mayor Pro Tem Nancy Fortune.
Present.
Mayor John Graham.
Present. Okay, well, good evening. We have five discussion items on our agenda tonight. The first one is a presentation of our comprehensive food access report. I believe Karen Bechtold is going to lead that off. So Judy, if you could bring Karen in, please.
Yes.
Good evening. Can you hear me?
Yes. Mm-hmm.
Okay. Well, good evening, Mayor Graham and council members. Thank you for inviting me to this work session. As noted, I'd like to provide an overview of the city's comprehensive food assessment. This is a planning department project, and when I transitioned to Public Works in January, I continued to manage this project. A comprehensive food assessment means that we're collecting all aspects of data and information about our food system and looking at how our residents procure, distribute, and access food. And the reason for doing this now is that we have several plans that really supported this action. Plan Manitou, the environmental resolution passed last fall, and primarily the city adopted a resolution to partner with Live Well Colorado and the Healthy Eating Active Living program to really focus on our community health, including food. And I think we were at a point where we wanted to initiate some actions that supported social sustainability in our community. We accessed an $8,000 budget using remaining funds from 2019 and 2020 funds and engaged a consultant to provide us with some specific input about food policies. And we crafted this to be initially fairly high level in order to address our budget constraints. And in May, Administrator Howell, Denise, recommended that I focus a little bit more on implementation as access to food was becoming more of a priority. So as we move forward, we really wanted to address two questions. What is the extent of food insecurity in our community, and how can we reduce it? And how can we improve access to healthy food for all? Judy, are you able to pull up my presentation?
Let me find it. Hang on, I'm having a difficult time with the linked program here.
So to start out, we thought a bit about our public participation process, and the document includes a summary of how we crafted that. So some key tools were that we hosted a kickoff meeting in early December That yielded a really great list of stakeholders that we should include in the process. We prepared a community survey that we launched over the holidays. We convened a food advisory committee of local food providers, a farm representative, some of our regional partners. We also wanted to get more information from those groups. And so we reached out and hosted some more specific conversations and stakeholder groups with them. So Judy, this is the report. I think it's the other attachment.
Oh,
We planned to hold 2 community meetings. We held one on February 19th. The second one, unfortunately, we did not hold due to our social distancing requirements. So as we started the project, we first looked at background data that would provide a good indicator of food insecurity in our community. And so this is primarily quantitative data.
hang on, let me just get it back.
So, primarily we look at income, which is the key indicator of potential food insecurity. And what's interesting is in our community is that about 1/3 of our residents have an income of below 35,000. About 1/3 have an income above 100,000, and that's quite a disparity. But that lower category obviously is what we'll focus on. Federal government prepares statistics and data that help guide implementation of federal food programs, such as supplemental nutrition assistance and the free and reduced lunch program. I think you can go forward maybe one more. There we go. Okay, that's good. And what we found early on is that based on our income levels, we have a much lower participation in the supplemental nutrition program than you might expect. We also have rapidly rising rental costs in our community. That puts a burden on individuals with their food budget. And age can also play a factor in food insecurity, maybe not so much related to income in our community, but related to factors such as mobility and health. And so as I noted, we initiated a survey to get more input from our residents about how they access their food and what they would like to see in the community. We received 144 complete responses. That's quite a bit lower than we'd hoped to get. When we did our housing survey, we got about 300 responses, which is a little more robust. But we did get very good diverse representation in some key areas across income categories, good participation from households with kids, good range of ages. And so we learned that 13% of survey respondents have participated in some type of food program like a pantry. 22% weren't sure if they were eligible for a food program. About 24% thought the cost of living did impact their ability to buy healthy foods. And of respondents who thought that food was unaffordable, about 100 respondents, 38% have limited the size of a meal, 27% skipped a meal, which is pretty significant. Also in our survey, we wanted to learn about what food-related activities residents are currently undertaking and what they're interested in. So we learned that 52% have a garden and 22% participate in community-supported agriculture, which means that they purchase a share through a farm in the beginning of the season to receive a weekly food allotment, fresh food allotment. when we asked what programs residents supported, we actually got support for a wide range of activities, including community gardening, community supported agriculture. And the top response was a farm to school program, which is a program to direct fresh local foods to schools and typically to involve students in an educational component. And we do have some component of that in the community right now at Flying Pig Farms. Also important to consider that not everybody wants to garden or has the means to do that. So we want to have some opportunities to access food for those who don't want to dig in and themselves. Well, I noted that we also held conversations with individuals and stakeholder groups to get more information about what's going on in the community and identify some challenges and some successes. And so just a few takeaways from these conversations, and there's much more detail in the report. And at the center of this universe, our local universe, are our regional partners, and that would be Care and Share Food Bank, El Paso County Public Health and Human Services, Westside Cares Human Services. They really initiate many of our support services. We have local food providers. We learned from St. Andrew's Community Food Pantry that they serve 40 to 50 individuals a week. And they've observed that fewer transient individuals and more permanent residents, familiar faces, are attending the food pantry. At our school district, they continue to provide support to children who are living in temporary housing situations in accordance with federal law. And then we also talked with advocates, for instance, our URA director, our Arts Center director, about opportunities to expand fresh food retail. And we convened a group of farmers and gardeners, and that was very enlightening. We learned that the number of local farms in our region, our Pikes Peak region, is rapidly decreasing, which is cause for concern about both the quality of our food as well as vulnerability to shocks to our food distribution system. And I think we're experiencing some of those currently. It's also really important to put out there that our regional partners were very supportive of this project and basically said, we're here to help. Please keep in touch with us and just let us know how we can help you. So we've got a great network out there. We did convene a food advisory committee, and this included about 8 to 9 residents representing our schools, our local pantry, farming, our garden club, food retail, and our regional partners. And they did identify some key themes that really, I think, underlie our recommendations. We observed that they think a lot of residents are really unaware of the depth of food insecurity in our community. They did acknowledge that we have some really effective organizations in place. They're primarily moving forward through volunteer efforts, a lot of effort, a lot of coordination. And so they really think that we need to work smarter, not necessarily harder, to narrow our focus and improve our coordination. They think maybe there's a need for someone in the community to take on a coordination role. They think it's important to better understand food needs in our community, exactly how much food is needed, by whom, when. And they've observed that some barriers do exist for some individuals. So that's an overview of a lot of information. And there's, of course, much more detail in the report. And staff put quite a bit of effort into trying to format the report so that it's useful and user-friendly for community leaders and also for community members, because we hope that community members and representatives from organizations can utilize this information for grants or to inform other actions. And so implementation framework really refers to kind of the what and how that we're recommending. And I think at the end of this, I found that one of our goals is really to illuminate our food system and the issues involved in it, simply for background knowledge. We do want to strengthen existing partnerships with all of these organizations. It's important to consider the role of city staff in this effort. So planning effort really drove this project. We think probably staff from a number of departments may be involved in some way. Public Works, certainly our pool and fitness director has stepped up to take on some actions related to the environmental resolution, and there's some potential for having more of a hub at our pool. And I think really we're looking for opportunities for staff to facilitate and collaborate other efforts as needed, and to perhaps spearhead some efforts and some actions when it's appropriate. When we looked at opportunities, we divided them into 3 groups. There's some that are short-term that we can do relatively easily. There's some that are midterm that involve more staff input, community partner input and funding, and then long-term opportunities that probably need to be vetted a little bit further. And I think because we didn't have the second community meeting, some of these more complex actions require more research and more community discussion. There's also a phase 2 assessment that was recently completed by El Paso County, and I actually participated in the phase 1 assessment. And what I found from reviewing this document is that they've paid a lot of attention and want to empower neighborhoods to help define some of their own solutions. And I also saw that there's a lot of overlapping recommendations between their report and ours. And so I think there's potential for coordination. And they also provided some really great information on implementations, such as cost estimates. So within the report, at the end of the main body of the report is a section that is part of the implementation framework, and we called that an opportunity matrix. And so this is really where the recommendations in the report are housed. And these compile lots of feedback that we got throughout the process. And as I mentioned, when we started this project, we were looking at more high-level recommendations. But based on where we are now, at this point in time, it was prudent to add a little bit more detail to these recommendations, to think about who might be the lead to move them forward, staff capacity, and funding needed to get them off the ground. So in terms of short-term opportunities, I put more focus on resources and staff capacity for these actions. And so some of the primary ones are first to improve awareness of food insecurity and resources in our community for all residents. And actually I should note that all of these actions have actually begun in one form or another, I think as a result of both this project and where we are with this very challenging public health situation. So our public information officer has actually been working with Westside Cares to coordinate some of their programs and put the word out through social media. And our police department is also getting involved in working with Westside Cares and getting accurate information about resources to share with our residents. And I'll be drafting some articles for the Pikes Peak Bulletin about really some of these report findings. And then looking at number 3, we actually did initiate a mobile food drop-off with Karen Share. And this was a direct outcome of, I think, building our relationship through this project. And so we began monthly food drop-off events in June. And I've been working with our planning director, and other staff have been really critical in getting the word out for this. Another key action is to address this issue of under participation in federal food programs and undertake some actions to get the word out to residents about how they can enroll in these programs. And I think within all of these actions, we're trying to potentially create a role for community members to take on some of these as well. And then I'll also add that after completing this report, I was contacted by one of our advisory committee members who is a farmer. And she had a couple of suggestions. She thought that we needed to put a little more emphasis on the farm to school program and use it as an opportunity for local education on healthy foods. And she noted that there are some very good grant programs for farm to school, and that it would be helpful if we noted city collaboration and support on these efforts and highlighted that grant program. And she also supports and works for the Colorado Farm and Art Market in downtown Colorado Springs, and thought that might be a resource for us in revitalizing our own community market. And then just to touch on briefly medium-term opportunities. An example of that would be to conduct some more outreach to better understand our food needs. And we might want to work with some local graduate students, some trained individuals who've been trained in outreach for that type of program. So that would take a little bit more capacity. Some long-term actions are a little bit more complex. For instance, one addresses the potential of having a food advisory board. That's a board that would convene regularly to help move some of these actions forward. So as I was wrapping up this presentation, I revisited the Live Well Colorado resolution. And what it says is that our community will collaborate with community organizations to involve and implement creative, healthy living policies and strategies, monitor, track, and report the results. So I hope that sounds consistent with how we framed this project. And so I guess moving forward, I think it is important to think about the city's role in facilitating some of these actions. And my goal with this was really to keep city involvement flexible, because we know that we need to do a lot of shifting to address priorities as they evolve, and to really try to create an opportunities to engage community partners to assist us or perhaps to lead actions. And we do have this unexpected focus on food now, so this is very timely. And so really, I'm just interested in hearing your feedback, if there were any surprises that came out of this report, and just want to confirm that you think the opportunity matrix is the appropriate approach for this project. And of course, I'm willing to answer questions.
Council members, I think now would be a good time to run questions past Karen. I see Councillor Chandler, you have your hand up.
I have a number of questions, so I'll just ask one at a time, give other council members a chance. First of all, I wanted some clarity on the IAPP, the International Association of Public Participation. You outlined 5 levels of participation, and in your report you stated that Manitou was committed to a level 3 of 5, and that level was involved. Can you tell me a little bit more about the 5 levels and what that means, our level of involvement?
I can, and I undertook this training in the fall, and so I thought this was a good opportunity to try to apply some of those principles. And this is a very well-regarded organization, and they indicate this, as they call it, a spectrum of involvement, going from inform to empower. So inform is the starting level and empower is the final level. And what they stress is that one level is not better than another, but you really need to kind of work within the framework of available decision-making and resources. And so I saw us as working within the involve and collaborate spaces. I think we did reach collaborate as well, which is stage 4. Stage 5, empower, they describe that as placing final decision-making in the hands of the public. And I wasn't sure we got there, I think based on financial constraints. We do have some constraints on what we can do within this realm. But I do feel like we did very much involve and that we very much collaborated. I think it would have been preferable if we could have made it to second community meeting. I think that might have really pushed that collaboration to maybe a more authentic level.
Thank you. Appreciate that.
Welcome.
Who has the next question? Councillor Wolf?
Thank you. Karen, and maybe it was in the packet, I don't remember, but you mentioned something about bringing resources to Manitou to help people sign up for SNAP or WIC. Would that have to be an employee of a particular department, or are there other folks who would be able to get the necessary sign-up materials to offer that? Like, even if every time we have a festival or an event where maybe there could be a sign-up table, but I don't know really what the process is to sign up, and if you really need to have a DHS employee there, or if other folks could take the lead on that. Do you know?
Well, this is something I've been learning more about. To ultimately enroll somebody, it has to be somebody in an office such as Care and Share or the State Department of Human Services or El Paso County. But there are a lot of different ways to get people to that endpoint. And one is that Care and Share has a program called SNAP Ambassadors. And so they seek residents and they'll work with them to train them and utilize them as assistants to help enroll other residents. And I think it's valuable because it's a peer. I think typically the ambassadors work or function, say, within Westside Cares. I'm not sure how much they function outside of that structure, but it's certainly possible. Other approaches are simply publicizing where residents can go in community newsletters, social media, at our pool. In conversations with Care and Share about our mobile food truck, one of the staff people offered to come to our distribution and help enroll people or to provide us with material to provide to people. So I think there's a lot of different ways of doing this.
Do you need to have a permanent address to qualify?
That is a great question. I think that you do, but I'm not 100% sure. I can follow up on that.
Willowbrook has a comment, perhaps in regard to that. Susan, you have the floor.
I'm not sure about the answer either, but I do know that we have some people in Manitou who do get SNAP benefits who are considered homeless. I know that in the past they had used ESM downtown in Colorado Springs because they offered that service where you could have an address and use their address so that you could qualify for benefits. So Karen, that might be a great question to follow up on it because ESM is closed. And I know that we had a number of homeless people in town who were using them for that address that Councilor Wolf mentioned so that they could get these benefits. So if you could follow up on that or somehow, some way, that'd be great.
Sure, I would be happy to do that.
I will say if you look at the SNAP website, it has very specifically who's eligible, and it doesn't show that you have to have a home. You do have to have a social security number and as a citizen's status. So that is one of the things that's required. But it does not say that you have to have a home. You may need an address where you can get something, but it does not require that you have a house address.
Susan, did you have a follow-on question? Any further comments or questions?
I do have one follow-on question. Karen, have you ever, as part of this this research, reached out to Food Maven? They're in Colorado Springs. They were started here. They're here, Denver, and Dallas, Fort Worth, and they do kind of a unique thing. You can see them at foodmaven.com, and I don't want to go into details about it, but during COVID, they started delivering to Manitou, and there are some opportunities there for bulk buying foods that otherwise would get lost in the system. Mm-hmm. They do a high quality product, and I just wanted to mention that that's a potential partnership if you want to add that to your list.
So I do recall that one of our residents who works for Food Maven attended the kickoff meeting, so that could be a potential contact.
We're at 30 minutes.
Yeah, 30 minutes. We need to kind of, I want to let the other council members have a chance to speak. Then we need to sum this up real quick. Mr. Shady, do you have comments?
Yes, Karen, I was wondering with this 18% that is below the poverty line, what kind of focus can we show to kind of help those folks that are in the most need?
Well, I think there's some things that we can do in the realm of education. One aspect that's important is that that individuals that are at such a high level of food insecurity need food from a lot of different resources. And we learned from, I did speak with 5 different families experiencing food insecurity, and I learned that it's challenging to cobble together all of these different programs, especially given time constraints. And so we could certainly provide some access to resources and put those out there through social media or through our food pantries and other venues. We also have a recommendation, it's a midterm recommendation to explore options to reduce transportation barriers. For instance, subsidized grocery delivery, free bus passes, and also subsidizing community agriculture shares. Those would both take some financial resources.
Thank you. Mr. Bremner, do you have comments?
No, I don't. Thanks.
Okay. Thank you. Mayor Pro Tem.
No, thank you.
Okay. We this is a subject we could probably talk about all night. Unfortunately, we don't have all night. We've got quite a bit of material to cover. So I think probably what we just want to do is we were asked to discuss and provide some implementation. I think real quickly, if the direction, if we could give some direction to the city. I think right now we're uncertain what our budget's going to be. At city staff, I think, is stretched about as thin as it can be. My inclination personally would be that a strong comment was made here that perhaps we could be a lot more systematic about this, that we could really coordinate things better, that we could get people signed up. Apparently there are good resources available. It's really sort of finding the people and getting them matched up. So that would be my thought going forward, to work with the existing partners and try to strengthen those relationships and be a more efficient system. And if we could find volunteers to help out with that seems to me to be a possible approach. Do we have other brief comments? Let's see. Councilor Chandler, please. And then
Yeah, this is a subject that's near and dear to my heart. I just want to throw out another resource, and that is the environmental work group that has now become the climate action work group that actually authored the environmental resolution for which you have spoken and resourced in your data. Is a group that's been just waiting to hear from you. I've reached out 2 or 3 times to ask if there's anything that this group can do. And so I want to offer that service to this group to you. I think that's on our list of, we have some motivated people. I'd like to know what our next steps are, but also I just want to remind people and maybe leave us with that. And to me, the most important thing on the slide was, of respondents that felt food is unaffordable in Manitou, 38% have limited a size of a meal, and 27% of our residents who responded have skipped a meal. And that's just not okay with me. And so I just think that we need to make this front and center. I'd like to know more, Karen, and I'll reach out to you on a separate level about CSAs and what we can do, community gardens. And so I just think there's lots of resources. Climate Action Work Group is definitely a group that wants to work with you, and please reach out to us, and we want to help you.
All right, thank you.
Councilor Wolf, I believe you had your hand up also. Councilor Wolf.
Oh, thank you. I just wanted to ask Karen if one of the churches that provides free food for people already, if any of them would be willing to donate their space during the food pickup to invite someone from Care and Share or DHS to sign up some of those folks and ask them if they want to give it a try, and to maybe even use the church address for those whose addresses change so frequently that they don't feel they should sign up because they move every 6 weeks to a different motel or what have you. If we could see if one of the churches could step up in that role to help us.
Sure, we can do that.
Great.
Or the SNAP ambassador potentially could function in that setting.
Good. Thank you. And Denise, I believe you also had comments to make.
Oh, I was just going to say, if we can get, I think the other thing is if we can get some SNAP ambassadors in our community, that would be helpful. So maybe it's reaching out to the environmental work group and see if we could get a couple of them to do that. I think that's, I will say Care and Share is a great first step. St. Andrews is continuing to provide Silver Key, and just the education that we're trying to get out there now, I think are great first steps as we move forward. And probably the social ambassadors is the next step.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Well, Karen, thank you very much. This was a nice presentation. I was impressed with the report. It covers there's a lot of information in there. So thank you. And I hope that'll be a roadmap for us going forward.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. And please thank everyone who was involved in that.
I will. Thank you.
Good. Next item on the agenda is the discussion of the micro mobility ordinance. Okay, and I believe that Christine will be presenting that. Christine from planning.
I think Christine and Dylan, is that right?
And Dylan, okay.
I think both of them, but I'm not sure. Christine can answer that.
Okay. Yeah, so Judy, if you could.
Christine,
Bring Christine in.
brought over.
Both of them.
Hi, I'm here. Yeah, let's bring Dylan over.
Okay, great. Okay, we've got you both. Christine, you've got the floor.
All right. Hey, nice to see everyone tonight. Dylan's done a lot of work on this topic. This has been a topic that has been very important in the planning department for about a year. And early this year, just as I was coming in, there was a renewed focus on this issue, and Dylan expressed a lot of interest in it. And so what we did is he did a lot of the groundwork, a lot of the legwork on this, and put together a presentation and has some really interesting thoughts and perspective. So I think what I'd like to do is actually let Dylan provide this presentation. He and I will both stay on and be here to answer questions, because we do expect this will be a fairly, well, it may not be a fairly rigorous topic, but it may be a topic that there will be some interesting dialogue around. So, Dylan?
Evening, counselors. Good to see you all. Hope you're doing well. Judy, could you pull up the PowerPoint presentation, please? Is Judy, oh, there she is, okay. All right, so as you all know, this proposed ordinance is regarding micromobility and micromobility share operations and businesses. I've been working on this for the last several months. A lot of groundwork had been laid essentially before I even came on board with it. So a lot of what I've done is talking with people and compiling a lot of information. So there are a lot of stakeholders and partners involved in this micromobility thing, and a lot of interest. And this is not a comprehensive list of the stakeholders or of the partners. There are others. And I just want to point out that the Manitou and Pikes Peak Cog Railway is not a partner. They are a stakeholder. In case they're listening tonight, they wanted that to be fairly clear. So a lot of the regulations came out of a lot of work that had been done prior to me coming on board. So the Transportation and Mobility Master Plan study, there's a state of the system section, and they make some recommendations as far as they recommend that we get some sort of operation like this going to help reduce some congestion and parking issues. There was another document that was given to me out of, it looked like a collaborative effort between Pike Ride, Pac-Man, I believe Aaron Schultz, and a couple other groups. That was a hugely helpful document in drafting the ordinance. And I've had conversations with Pike Ride, and they've sent me some information as far as their kind of desired sites and what their little stations and docking hubs look like. So that was helpful as well as using our existing ordinances and other existing regulations in comparable communities. So it's been a fairly involved process just bringing it all together. You can scroll down, please. So part of this ordinance is a pilot program that lasts in duration for a year. And the pilot program is basically to allow us to kind of test out and evaluate these types of operations and businesses, and to determine whether or not they are improving anything, or if they're more trouble than they're worth, really. Under that program, it'll allow 2 initial businesses or operators with 3 hubs each, no more than 20 vehicles per station. That can be increased throughout the pilot program after the first quarter. They're required to collect certain data that'll help us evaluate the effectiveness of this program in these types of operations. So as far as licensing and insurance for these types of operations, they'd have to get a business license with the city. And they'd be required to hold 3 different types of insurance. One is a workman's comp and employer's liability coverage to the amount of $100,000. Automobile liability insurance to the tune of $500,000 and commercial general liability coverage for $1 million for damage to property and things like that. I've also stuck in an indemnity clause into the regulations as a means to help limit and mitigate some of our liability as far as these types of operations. Regarding zoning and permitting for these docking hubs and stations, they'll have to get a property improvement permit and provide a site plan. Pretty typical for how we permit other installations. The parking spaces, each parking space at minimum is about 6 feet by 3 feet. And if you look at the image there on the right, that's actually a cut sheet that was provided to me from Pike Ride. So you can kind of get an idea of what some of these sites may look like. Those docking hub, those parking spaces essentially could house a maximum of 2 micromobility share vehicles. And as far as the zoning, in terms of those docking hubs and stations, if they're located in the right-of-way, they've got to be 1.5 feet back from the curb line, and they've got to allow 6 feet of pedestrian access, essentially. If they're located on private property or even public property that's not in the right-of-way, they'll have to meet the development standards for that zone, including setback requirements, those types of zoning requirements. Some additional requirements in the regulations, the operators and businesses who run these businesses are required to retrieve any abandoned vehicles or vehicles that haven't been returned to a hub within 24 hours of their last rental. They'll have to have some sort of leasing agreement with the leasee who's renting the share vehicle. And it basically, the regulations don't allow for e-scooter share or e-skateboard share businesses, but they do allow for e-bike class 1 and 2. Potentially you could allow class 3. I'll let you guys discuss that. Scroll down, please. And some potential modifications and additions to the regulations that we're looking at adding. We may rearrange some sections as far as the business licensing and insurance requirements. We might move that, we're gonna move that under the business licensing section of the code. We'll have to add the findings for the e-scooter share and e-skateboard share. And we'll have to add a penalties and violations section. And another item that you may want to discuss is rider requirements as far as helmets or other safety gear. So if you have any questions, I'd be happy to answer them and help facilitate any of the discussion.
Christine, did you have comments too before we go into the questions phase?
No, I don't. Dylan covered all the points.
Okay.
I think
Okay.
that it is important to just note that the actual ordinance itself is still it's still being worked through exactly what that'll look like. So
Okay, still a work in progress. Okay, so that said, let's go ahead and entertain questions. Mr. Bremner, you had your hand up, I think, first.
So in the first part of your briefing, you said there would be 2 initial operators. Does that So what are you going to do? Go out for RFPs, like who wants to do this, and then pick who's most qualified? How are you going to determine who the operators are?
So there's a permit process for that pilot program. They'll have to apply through the planning department. We're gonna have to create an application for that, but it's essentially a first come, first serve. And we expect Pike Ride to probably be one of those first two.
Yeah, I think it's important to note, it's not our intent at this time that we would go out for RFP and specifically solicit for this. I think it would be nice to start with one, get through this, through some of the kinks, figure out what's working and what's not working in the pilot program, and then we as a city may say, wow, we could use some more bikes, and we might put out an RFP for it at that point. I don't foresee that during this calendar year, though. That's a great question.
And the regulations under the pilot program section also has a piece in it that allows us to kind of modify or alter that operation under the pilot program, kind of as we see fit or as time goes, as more information is returned to us from their data collections and things like that.
Very good. Steve and then Julie. Steve, go ahead, ask your next question. And then,
so it sounds like you already have somebody in mind. Somebody actually been talking to you, like they're ready to do it, or?
As far as an operator?
Yeah.
Yeah, so we've been in communication with Pike Ride. They have some docking hubs and stations and an operation running in Colorado Springs currently, but they've shown some interest.
Yeah, it's a really good deal. Pike Ride is an experienced operator. They're a nonprofit. They do have some subsidies from the city of Colorado Springs. They have gone ahead in their most recent application to CDOT for grants. Were awarded a portion that would support establishing an operation in Manitou Springs. So we're still trying to determine if that would cover the entire cost. It likely will, but we haven't gone through all the machinations of that. But yeah, Pike Ride is right here by us. They've been offering demos and they're quite interested in doing this.
They've even requested some site visits to some locations that they're interested in as well. But we didn't have anything to evaluate them against at this time because the regulations aren't there yet, so.
Right.
Christine, I know Pike Ride or Dylan came to a previous council meeting about a CDOT grant and asked for support. We at that time said we would support depending on how this moves forward.
Correct.
Okay, thank you.
Wolf is next, and then Councillor Chandler. Councillor Wolf.
Is this our opportunity to comment on the proposed ordinance, or does that come after the next part of the presentation? Oh, say it now.
Now would be the time, yeah.
Oh, I just had
or all ears.
I just had a few suggestions to think about, if I may.
Sure.
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay, this is 18.91.070C. And I would just suggest that you provide some standards by which staff shall make their decisions, because that provision says that there may be allowed for scholarships or ads to be placed on the vehicles themselves, but that would be decided by planning. And if planning has no standards or guidance from us on how to decide, then I think that could be problematic for them. The other thing is that 18.91.070 subsection E, I think it should say that the operators must be able to demonstrate, and here are the new words to add, that their vehicles have the ability. In other words, those few words were missing from the sentence. And so the sentence made it sound like the operators themselves have to demonstrate that the operators have varying ability to navigate different elevations, but I think you meant they have to prove that their vehicles can navigate. And then it wasn't clear to me about who would be responsible for reaching that conclusion or doing that assessment to determine if the vehicles can adequately manage the elevations. And the sentence was also so vague that it just said, we have to make sure the vehicles have the ability to, well, it says the operators, but I think they mean the vehicles, have the ability to navigate various elevations. But then it specifically said you could only go on Manitou Ave and certain other streets. I just didn't know who was going to do that assessment. If that would be the planning department would have to hire an expert, or if the planning department gets on the vehicle and uses it herself and says, well, that was fun, that worked fine, or, you know, just to be clear, because that was kind of vague. And then under the Geo Fencing requirements, and I have no idea what Geo Fencing is, but under 18.91.090 subsection B as in boy, I had a question about that. It said you have to stay off the sidewalk, but you also have to stay as close to the edge of the pavement as possible. So does that mean when they drive along Manitou Ave, for example, and there's a parked car, that they can't be next between the parked car and the traffic? They have to squeeze between the parked car and the 3 little inches to the sidewalk? Or maybe I didn't understand that part of the ordinance, but it sounded impossible.
So they basically, under these regulations, they have to follow the Model Traffic Code 2010, which is what the city of Manitou follows. It doesn't allow these types of vehicles on the sidewalks. What it's referring to within the edge of pavement is the paved roadway, essentially. So they have to follow all traffic regulations, just like a bicyclist or a vehicle.
So Dylan, your interpretation of that code then, at least as close as possible to the pavement.
It doesn't say that. It says they have to be within the edge of pavement.
So that means they would be not really on the edge of the pavement. They would be on the driver's side of the parked car, basically.
No,
Is that right?
No, so it says they have to be within the edge of pavement of the right of way. So that's the street, essentially, anywhere in the street.
Oh, okay. And then I would just suggest, just for clarity, that 18.91.120 and 18.91.130, where since they exclude the electric scooters and the electric skateboards, I think you should remove that language that includes the skateboards, and then you take it out later at the very, very end. I thought that should be more at the beginning so that people don't get confused or misled. That's just a minor thing. The whole ordinance seems to include scooters and skateboards that are electric until you get to the very end of the ordinance. So I just thought that was a little...
Yeah, so the idea behind it is referring to mostly them as micro mobility share vehicles throughout the ordinance. And that's just in case, you know, at a later date, you guys decide, well, we want to allow electric scooters. It's easier to update.
And my very last question is unrelated to the ordinance, but is the $500,000 liability insurance, am I understanding right that that would be the amount of coverage available to an injured person who makes a claim against the operator? Is that right?
So the $500,000, I think, was the automobile. So that's like automobile accidents, injuries to parties, and then the general coverage is more damage to property and individuals that way.
So if I'm not in an automobile, I'm on an electric bike, and it fails to work properly and I get injured, that's not one of the insurances you're requiring, or is that covered under the liability policy?
I guess I'm not quite sure what you're asking.
Well, you said the 500,000 insurance was for vehicles, but we're not renting, I mean, for automobiles, but we're not renting automobiles. We're renting electric
No,
bikes.
but if they run into an automobile or have an accident with an automobile, they've got to have that coverage.
There's also
Oh, okay.
there's also a
Yeah.
process in this where the operator will bring vehicles into the city for maintenance, moving the objects and that sort of thing. So we also had to think about that part of it. So folks on the bike, folks who are driving vehicles that are associated with the operator. When Jeff Parker does his final review on this, my hunch is we may clear up the language a little bit more. I understand where you're at and what you're asking, but we had to kind of think about both, like so the person on the bike and then the operator bringing the bikes.
Christine, do you know if that best practices when you guys looked at that? That was the best practice, right?
Yeah, these amounts were pretty typical across different communities. Dylan also pulled some of this from Colorado Springs and other communities within Colorado. I would like, I think you brought up a good point a few minutes ago, Councilor Wolf, with regard to who does the evaluation on where the bikes could go. This was sort of, we were towards the end of working on this when Pike Ride brought their bikes over, and we did some riding around the city. And then Chief Churchill and some of the officers thought, let's ride these up Ruxton and go, and the bikes couldn't go up. And so it dawned on us at that point that we need to make sure that if there is some sort of bike station or expectation that people can take these bikes up Ruxton, they need to go up Ruxton. And this is something that is unique compared to what Pike Ride is doing in Colorado Springs. So I think we're going to need to work through exactly what the procedure is on this policy. So that was one. That was a good question. So thank goodness Chief Churchill tried that out. That told us, gave us some really good insights there. The other thing was around specific streets. That was a really interesting topic to think about, because do we, as a matter of policy, want to keep people only on specific streets, or could someone go visit their friend in Crystal Hills, for instance? And that's where we're starting to have that conversation by introducing specific streets. And within the planning department, we kind of went round and round and back and forth on that, and that might be something that's up for discussion here with this group.
Thank you. Other councilors, do you have questions?
We have 6 minutes.
Go 6 minutes. Okay. Mr. Shada, do you have any questions? Mr. Shada, you're muted. I guess that was a no.
No, sir. No, sir.
No. Okay. Councilor Chandler?
All of my questions were asked and answered by Councilor Wolf. Thank you. But I guess discussing the Ruxton Avenue issue. So the class 3 and 4 that are currently not permitted, would those bikes get you up Ruxton Avenue because they're a little more powerful? And do we need to think about that for the future, Dylan?
Yeah, so class 4 is technically a moped.
Okay.
Just gonna throw it out with a throttle. Class 3 might be something you could consider. That goes up to I think 28 miles an hour.
Okay.
As far as, I don't know if it's an issue of power in these things, or I don't know if adding the additional class 3, I don't know if that's going to help with the elevation.
Okay, got it. Because that was my question of why are we not then allowing class 3 into the mix? That was my only question. Thanks.
Okay, thank you. Councilor Wolbrook?
I don't have any questions. Thank you.
Mayor Pro Tem Fortune?
Yeah, first of all, I have a class 1 bike and I can easily get up Ruxton. So it just depends on the bike. I won't say easily, but quite easily, given it's a bike. I have about 15 questions, so I will email them to Dylan. Thanks.
Thank you.
And I think probably other council members asked the questions that I was interested in.
Steve,
Steve, do you have another question?
Well, I just had a comment, you know, as somebody who's ridden up Ruxton quite often, it just depends on the gear system that you have on your bike. So I have a road bike that I have trouble at least going the last little bit up to my house, but I have another mountain bike that I can gear down pretty good and I can pedal pretty good. So just a matter, I think you can do it with any bike. It just has to be sophisticated enough for the gearing system.
Okay, good, thank you. So Christine and Dylan, question to you. This is a work in progress, obviously. Are there any outstanding major questions that you need direction from us at this point? And maybe that's not a question for tonight, but in the near term.
Safety equipment. Do you want to require helmets? How do you think that would work?
I would agree with that. Safety equipment and then boundaries. When we're talking about this geo fencing, you know, are you willing to have these bikes all over town, or would you like them constricted primarily to the business district and areas where tourists are most likely to be?
Okay. So Mayor Pro Tem, you have a response on that?
Yeah, I do. We have 3 more minutes. I would say helmets are critical, but I know that when I was with Pac-Man, we went around and around and around, and at this point, there aren't really good solutions for requiring helmets. I think it's something that we'll have to continue looking at the technology to figure out a way to do it, but currently, it's probably not doable today.
Mm-hmm.
And in terms of geofencing, I would say that that's probably a good idea for this pilot. And as I read the ordinance, it was really for a 1-year pilot to collect data. So I would go ahead and geofence probably the neighborhoods initially. You've got the flexibility to ungeofence as you go along to see what else is appropriate. But for the pilot, I'm always one to start small and incrementally increase after you get the data to support it.
Christine, Dylan, is that sufficient direction, do you think? Does that give you some idea what to do?
I think so, yeah.
Okay, great. Okay, well, very good. Thank you both very much for the presentation. That's interesting. We'll look forward to seeing the next iteration of this.
Thank you for your time.
Thank you. Have a good night.
Great. Good night. Yes, good night. Okay, the next topic is an overview of the debt and the budget by the city's financial advisors, presented by Robin Moore and Amy Canfield of Stifel. I hope I pronounced that right. We're expecting that to take about an hour. Is there anyone who'd want to take a break at this point and come back, or should we push through for the next hour? Okay, hearing no objection, let's go ahead and push through. So Judy, if you'd go ahead and bring in our 2 presenters, Robin Moore and Amy Canfield.
I'm going to take 1 minute and eat a few things.
Sure.
Hi, everyone.
Good evening.
Hello.
Yes, I'm going to start us off and then hand it over. So the purpose of this presentation is for the city's financial advisors, Robin Moore and Amy Canfield of Stifel Financial Corporation, and I hope I'm pronouncing that right because I've been pronouncing it that way for several months now, to present an overview of the city's water and wastewater infrastructure replacement financing, the budget process overview, financial policies, and planning for an election. And now I am passing the baton to Robin Moore.
Hi, everyone. Yeah.
Becca, may I just add a couple of quick things? Is that okay?
Of course.
I just want to talk about, they're also going to be talking about some bonding issues and that, but the city has never had a financial planner on board. And last year we looked at that to really have them help us decide how to move forward with capital projects, what's the best way to move forward from a strategic perspective, and if we decide to go to bonds or other options, to really do that very vast research and give us the best option as we move forward. So we went out to bid for this with an RFP, interviewed numerous companies, and brought on Robin at that time, who I believe Robin, you can talk about your background. You have, you work kind of in this area and in this community. So that was part of the reasons why we brought her on. So with that, I'll go ahead and turn it over.
Sure. Good evening, everyone. I'm Robin Moore, and my colleague Amy Campfield's on. In my checker box, she's on the bottom right. We're with Stifel, and we are the city's financial advisor or municipal advisor. The primary role that we serve is to help you think about debt issues and funding capital projects. We'll talk a little bit tonight about some areas that remotely touch on debt issues that are more expansive when you look at your finances. And as Denise mentioned, we do a lot of work in your community. So I've been, I actually started my career in municipal government and joined, Stifel acquired the firm that I was with for about 15 years called George K. Baum and Company. And I was with that firm starting in 2004, and all that time have worked with your neighbors over at Colorado Springs Utilities. So they're about 2 weeks away from selling about $500 million of bonds. They've got about almost $2.5 billion of debt. We do a lot of work in the community with water utilities. So, you know, a lot of your neighbors, a lot of the municipalities. Amy's done a lot of work with communities all around the state, from Denver down to Colorado Springs and elsewhere. So we're excited to talk to you about kind of big picture tonight, and then more specifically about some of your water infrastructure projects, and then more generally about some of the projects that you're thinking about for the community as a whole, more general fund type projects, and how, you know, various scenarios as to how you would pay for those. So feel free to jump in. I know Zoom is a little more complicated for talking, but feel free to just interrupt at any time. So, you know, as I said, we're going to watch.
Robin,
yeah.
We need to pull up your PowerPoint.
Sure. I mean, you're welcome to. We're happy to talk, or, oh, there you go.
You want to pull that up as well?
There we go. Okay. So we're going to start off, as Denise and Becca had mentioned, when we first were introduced to your team, and the first order of business was to talk more specifically about water and wastewater projects. And you have a number of projects that it sounds like you're thinking about. And as you probably know, there's a variety of ways to pay for them. Obviously cash is one, but if you're going to spread out the payments over time, which is very common for municipalities and utilities here and elsewhere, you know, it kind of spreads the burden amongst ratepayers and community members over time, because a number of you know, years will pass when people enjoy the use of these projects. There's a few different ways, a couple in particular for the city that will work for financing. So we're going to start off talking more specifically about the water, wastewater, and then we're going to take a step back and talk about things that we would think about as, you know, if we were in your shoes going through the budget process, financial policies that will govern a variety of things, including funding these capital projects. And then the last item that we'll talk about is, you know, if there's interest in increasing the tax base to either finance capital projects or just to provide ongoing revenue. We'll just give you a few tidbits as to, you know, things to think about now for an election in 2021. So if we want to move to the next slide, I'm going to turn it to my colleague Amy to walk through some of the options for water, wastewater financing, and we'll move through those. And again, please feel free to just, you know, raise your hand or just jump in and interrupt us.
Great, thank you, Robin. And yeah, perfect. If you can get slide 3 up, that would be great. So this is an overview of the financing options that we've evaluated with the city. So we really honed in on 4 options. The first being a loan through Colorado Water Resources and Power Development Authority's Revolving Fund Loan Program. So the benefit of going through this program is that the city can borrow at the authority's AAA borrowing rate, and then they also get that subsidized to where they only pay 70% of that AAA rate. So as you look across, you'll see that this does have a much lower true interest cost, which results in lower payments as well. Another benefit of going through this program is that the city can rely on the authority to do a lot of the grunt work with the legal documents, and they also don't have to go through the rating process. So just overall, it's a little more streamlined, a little easier to access those monies. The downside is the city does have to rely on the authority's timing, as well as their requirements for covenants and structure. So that is our option one for the city's water and wastewater projects on the far left. The second option is to work with the authority to use their program called the Water Revenue Bond Resources Program. And that is similar, in which the city can rely on the authority to do a lot of the work and help through the process, but it does rely on the city's rating. So we did estimate an A- rating. Obviously that would change once we went to the rating agencies, but just to kind of show what the benefits are of this program, they do subsidize all costs up to $250,000. So that does have an added benefit to lowering that total borrowing cost for the city. The third option is if the city were to borrow on their own, they can issue their own bonds. Obviously that would be the city's rating again, but because they would be issuing on their own, it would require more time and effort from city staff to get that financing executed. Thirdly is a similar process for a bond, but one that is sold directly to a bank. So the benefit of this process is that it can be completed much quicker because there isn't going to be an offering document or a rating process. So typically we can see these done in about a month to 2 months timeframe. So with that, if anyone has any questions, I'm happy to dive into more details. I think we have been moving towards the revolving fund loan program just because the benefit of that subsidized rate is hard to pass up. And I think for the city, the timing seems to work okay with their fall timeframe to get that issued. So Robin, I'll hand it back over to you to jump into the next topic.
Great, thanks. Any questions on the water wastewater financing before we move on?
I just have one question.
Yeah.
This is Judith. I'm not familiar with what a PAR bond is. Could you explain that to me?
Sure.
PAR. Thank you.
Go ahead, Amy.
Sure. So that's kind of getting into the nitty-gritty of the structuring. But basically, typically when we sell bonds, they'll sell at a higher coupon rate to the yield, to the market yield. And that's just based on investor preferences. So
Okay.
if you look at where we have the par amount and the project fund,
okay,
in most of these, we're issuing less bonds than what the city is getting for the project amount. Do you see how it's, 1.28?
Oh, okay. I see that on
yielding 1.5.
Okay, thank you.
So that's because we're issuing premium coupons as opposed to par coupons. There is a little bit of premium generated. If you look at the FAR option where they are par bonds, because we're not getting that premium benefit, the debt that would be issued would be a little higher because we have to issue more bonds to get to the same project amount. So that's all that means. It would be a higher debt level to go that option.
Thank you so much. I see it. Okay, thanks.
The number, you care about the 1.5 million. You just care about how much money you're getting to spend on projects. Any other questions on water, wastewater? All right, well, let's take a step back. Why don't we slide over to page 5? And this is a real high-level overview of the budgeting process. And there's so many different ways we can take this conversation. The intent here is just to give a few guidelines for, thinking about if we're sitting in your shoes and you're reviewing a budget or thinking about the next year's budget, what are some of the things that you'd be thinking about? And the same philosophy is going to hold true when we get to the debt policies and the financial policies. So, some of this might be a repeat and a primer that you've heard many times before. So, please feel free to move us along. But, the real conceptual thinking of a budget is that it provides a framework for how you manage your money, how you spend it, and where the money comes from and how you spend it. I do think it's always important to remember that, so I think I had mentioned at the start, I started my career in municipal government. I wanted to be a city manager, but I remember right off the bat, someone said, to understand the budget and the finances is to understand everything. I mean, that's really, that's probably a big statement, but understanding where the money's coming from, how you're spending it, and what your goals are, and how you're setting those goals, and what your objectives are, and whether you're meeting them is sort of critical on the policy side. So, in this conversation, we're thinking a lot about the policy and the politics of budgeting. And then, Denise and her staff are on the administration side. So you set the policies, and then she goes forth, with your guidance as to, how the money gets spent and some of the more minutia. And so we clumped it into 3 main categories here. The budget is a policy guide to set priorities. It's an operations guide as to where you want to direct the money. And it's also a communications tool. So it helps the community understand what the priorities are and where you want to allocate the limited resources that you have. I mean, at every level of government, we're really operating under sort of a scarcity of resources. If they were, some communities are lucky, if you live in Aspen, they've got a pretty nice tax base, but, for the most part, we all have to manage the resources that we have. So, those are the 3 main overachieving goals of setting the budget, which makes it sound really easy, and clearly it's not. There's a lot that goes into it. So on the next slide, we talk a little bit more about kind of that next level down. Again, is sort of, if we were sitting in your shoes, what would we be looking at, and what would be thinking about as this document comes across with all these numbers, and it's always, I think, a little bit intimidating for, people in the financial world, let alone people who are not used to seeing financial documents. Typically we see, and I'll just kind of walk through these, but again, feel free to jump in and ask questions as we go along. There's typically two broad categories in your budget. There's the capital, and then there's the operating. So the capital are, the roads and the some of the equipment and the infrastructure that's going to be around for a while, and the operating budget. So salaries and benefits and insurance and all it takes to operate on a daily, weekly, monthly basis of the city. When I look at budgets, I like to look at the current year, but I also really look a lot at trends. So it's really hard for me. Every city, every utility, every level of government, I think of as their own little special snowflake. So everyone's got their own little uniqueness to them from various aspects of their finances. And to really understand what you're looking at, I think it's really important to look backwards, and it's important to think about going forward. And going forward is always a little bit harder because, it's anyone's guess as to what happens. And of course, going back doesn't necessarily predict going forward, but I always think it's really helpful. Like when we were thinking through issues for your city, we were, it was important to look at sales tax history, but not just of the last 3 to 5 years, to go back 20 years, because you see these trends and you see where, upturns and downturns and what happens in the best of circumstances and the worst. As for revenues and expenses, I do think it's important to keep an eye on the composition of revenues. And in Colorado, where the way the structure of our governments are set up, a lot of the municipal governments, including yours, is composed of a pretty high level of sales tax revenue. You know, so compared to other states that have more of a property tax and sales tax, you know, it's just inherently more volatile of a revenue stream. So, you know, thinking about where is that, and then getting into more granular detail, where is that sales tax coming from? You know, in Manitou Springs, it's, you know, there's some, you know, variable revenue sources, you know, the tourism and restaurants and shops and, you know, marijuana shops. So, you know, looking at who's contributing, what the, who comprises, let's say, the top 10% of, you know, sales tax revenue is going to be important. Looking at the expenses. So, you know, obviously in city government, you have a number of fixed expenses that you can't do much about, and then you've got discretionary expenses. So looking at those and figuring out what can I adjust every year and what is fixed and we really can't access or move around too much. Again, we talked about historical levels and trends. I think it's really important to that next bullet point when looking at a budget. One of the areas that is kind of embedded in assumptions is, you know, what are you assuming for growth? What are we assuming for revenue increases, not just next year, but let's say the next 10 years or 20 years? Same thing on the utility side. So, you know, a rate raising trend. We think it's really important to maintain a conservative outlook. You know, sometimes we see some big increases, and it's sort of hopeful that those will continue. But you know, you look at budgets long enough, and you realize that there's some years where we're going to trend up, and then there are some years where we're definitely going to trend down. And obviously, this year was a big, you know, awakening to a lot of us that could happen at any moment. One thing that I actually think is really important is what I should say one-time, it says one-time revenues. So if you get money in, but you don't expect it to come in again, and you know, certain revenues in your budget, I don't know that I'd characterize as one time, but you know, think about maybe the marijuana money. You know, if you don't expect that that's going to come in forever, like a property tax revenue stream is going to be somewhat reliable and consistent. But if you have a more volatile stream where you have a one-time influx of revenue, like let's just say you sell a building, I would not want to see a municipality use that to balance its budget or to rely on it for ongoing operations. You know, maybe use that money for a one-time capital project. And that's pretty consistent with what we see a lot of municipal government or utilities doing with one-time revenue sources. And then the last bullet there is also really important. And actually, when I look at a budget, that's the first thing I go to is their fund balance. So what do you have tucked away? We'll talk a little bit about the policies that the city team and we jotted down for you all to consider. But having a fund balance is really important, and knowing what it is and sticking to it. Because when you put your budget together, it's really tempting to allocate more revenue to projects and just sort of thinking, all right, well, next year will be better, so we'll tuck more away. But adhering to that fund balance policy is, you know, really one of the most critical pieces of budgeting.
Robin, can I just add a comment here? Because one of the things that we've been talking about, and we've been talking with Robin about, is that Manitou is very, and you guys all know this, is a great amount of our revenue comes from tourism. When we have spoken with our other regional partners, they have seen increases over these last couple of months due to them having a grocery store and a hardware store. And we don't have those things. So that changes Manitou of how we can look at this and even how we do projections.
Yeah, that's a great point. And then a couple of other things, these will get a little more into the minutia, but indirect cost allocations. So, you know, in city government, you've got some services that generate revenue, so your enterprise funds, but then you have, you know, a fair amount of expenses that are internal. So, you know, the finance staff, the IT staff, they're internal. So sometimes when municipalities go through the budgeting process, they want to know how much does it really cost? How much does it cost us to operate the parks, or how much does it cost to operate, you know, pick another service? And when you think about that question, you also have to realize that internally you have you have attorney costs, you have, you know, possibly an IT director that's using part of their time for, let's say, the Parks Department. So, you know, that becomes important when you start to think about, well, how much does it cost to operate this particular service? The next bullet is the one that, you know, gets us excited in our world, since we focus on bond issues, is, you know, pay as you go versus debt. And there's the philosophy of it and the more policy side of, you know, using up your cash. And then there's just the pure sort of math of it. You have so much cash to go around. If you have a project that you want to pay for, can you afford it with cash, or do you need to fund it over time with some sort of debt instrument? You know, again, there's also that sort of philosophical, if we're going to build, let's say we're going to build a wastewater treatment plant, that's going to be used for citizens in the next 30 years. So why should we make the citizens today pay for the full cost? So there's, you know, sort of both sides of that equation. And then a couple of other points here, budget amendments, and you know, this becomes more of an internal question. You know, like at what point do you want to start seeing changes to the budget? Is it, you know, every change? Is it a change over a certain dollar amount? Interfund transfers, and you know, I think remembering your budget, there is some of, you know, transfers between the utility and the general fund. You know, we see that a lot. Sometimes they're, you know, payment in lieu of taxes, internal transfers. You know, if you think about Colorado Springs Utilities, they make a payment to the city's general fund every year. It's, you know, there's different ways to calculate that. So, you know, that's sort of an internal question as to how you want to treat different, either the enterprises or other portions of your budget that might need to transfer in or out of the general fund. And the last two I think are really interesting from a, you know, how is the budget prepared? Who starts the process? Who participates in the conversations? You know, is it just staff? Is it city council setting a work, you know, having a work session and laying out their priorities? Is there citizen oversight? I would say, and this kind of jumps all the way to the end of the presentation, but if there is thought at some point that you want to go to the voters to increase taxes, and you know, you probably want to think about, you know, the accountability and just showing the community that there's, you know, these levels of oversight that are not just internal. It also builds buy-in and, you know, kind of gets you these stakeholders that are more engaged and actually understand the city budget. And then the last bullet is also sort of near and dear to my heart. I think it's important to do long-term planning, and, you know, it doesn't have to be very granular, but thinking about the projects that are not just in front of you for the next few years, but really as you go far out, you know, what does the city need from particularly from an infrastructure perspective? And, you know, we saw a lot of this in the last like 10, 15 years with the first downturn, and, you know, 08, 09, there was a lot of deferred maintenance. You know, and plans got shifted, and very rarely do the plans actually materialize the way they're meant to. But I think having a plan is really important, and it just sets the tone for not just the next year's budget, but, you know, against the backdrop of a longer horizon. So I'll pause there. Any thoughts or questions that we can address?
I actually have a quick question. On the first slide you showed us on the 4 options, do any of them require votes, or is it all city control? Is it all council and staff controlled?
So for your water wastewater projects, generally speaking, the way we're talking about financing the water wastewater projects, because it's an enterprise under Tabor, you do not need an election. So Tabor requires an election for a multiple fiscal year obligation with that's repaid with taxpayer money. And enterprise funds, so water utilities, wastewater utilities, airports, transportation in Colorado, those are enterprise funds, which are as long as they don't have more than 10% of the revenue coming from what's deemed like a tax or you know, federal loans or grants or something tax related, they qualify for an enterprise, and you can issue debt without an election.
Thank you, that's very helpful.
Sure. And as we move on later, we'll talk more about general fund projects, and that's a different ballgame.
Robin, let me just in there where you guys approved a rate case, a 5-year rate case, and that was part of the capital project. So all of that was in there as you approved it. So when we go out to look at how we're going to fund it, that was part of that rate case that we went through.
And this is just page 7 is just a graphical description of the things that you would do throughout a budget process, which you're probably familiar with. So why don't we move on to slide 8. And this is a framework for financial policies. And Denise and Becca have a more robust document that includes a lot of policies, but we wanted to talk real high level about what we would be looking at and what you're looking at, and make it a little more user friendly. So when you may have seen this pretty hardy document, to discern some of the key features in it. The one thing I would say, and this is not in the written bullets here, but I think the best policies are the most simple, because the best policies are policies that you can come back to, that you remember, that you all understand. So it's really easy to stick a lot of jargon into financial policies, but that's not helpful if you don't understand it, because the kind of like the budget, the policies are meant to help you make decisions. And we use them with our most complex issuers, your friends down the street at Colorado Springs Utilities. We've been the financial advisor for Denver Water for a while. They're also obviously a sizable utilities, all the way down to smaller entities that do one bond issue maybe every 10 years. But it's really important that not just Denise or not just Rebecca understands what's going on in these policies. It's really important that you all understand the key features. And so that when you have to make decisions, because it's probably what's going to come in front of you at some point, is should we issue debt? Should we not issue debt? How much debt should we issue? That you have a framework to help you make those decisions. So keeping that in mind, why would you have financial policies? To help you make decisions, to evaluate, and we focus this mostly on the debt, but we'll expand it a little bit more. But you're going to have a few debt-related questions in front of you. So this is going to help you decide, is debt the right thing to do, or should we pay cash? How much debt should we issue? What kind of flexibility do we want to leave ourselves regarding the size of the bond issue versus how much cash we want to keep on hand? So these will help you. They will help you set the framework, and they'll help staff make the actual decisions about what to do. There's a couple of things that we keep in mind. And I think I don't want to lose sleep, and I don't think you want to lose sleep about the decisions you're making related to finances. So all of the features of the decision to issue debt or not issue debt, what type of debt, they all should let you sleep at night. You don't want to take risks that are, for one, outside of the scope of what the organization is comfortable with, or outside what the markets are really comfortable with. You want to borrow money at a optimal cost of capital. So, whatever that means for your credit rating and your project, without sacrificing future flexibility or the ability to do what you need to on the operating budget. So the best example I can give is years ago when I started here in Colorado, this was about 15 years ago, we sold, we'll talk about this later, we sold a certificate of participation. So a library district all the way out on the west side of Colorado passed a sales tax election. They had money coming in every year. They wanted to build a beautiful new library, which they did. We sold debt for them. But the problem was it was in a community where the sales tax was a little more volatile. And over time, there was a little bit of a downturn, and the project cost escalated. So they ended up spending much more on the library. It was beautiful, much more on the library. The revenue came in lower than expected. And years down the road, the next library director finds my name, and he calls me and says, well, now I can't buy books and I can barely hire librarians. Well, that's kind of a bummer because you've got this beautiful library. So, we figured out a way to restructure the debt, but that's not what you want to do. You want to build the library that allows you to buy the books, operate the library, have the programming. And, the same thing on the city, at the city level. So, that's what we're here. Our job is to make sure that whatever you do, it leaves you the flexibility and kind of lets you sleep at night. So why don't we go down to the next page? And here's where we get to where you might feel like you want to put this on pause and go get a cocktail. The debt and financial policies, to get a little more specific. And I'm going to try to keep this really high level, but these are the few things that in this document that you're going to get, or maybe you've gotten already. These are the things that I look at. These are the things that Amy and I, when we do our analysis, they're the first things that we kind of analyze. Bonds get, and Amy alluded to this at the beginning, bonds get rated by rating agencies, most public bonds. These are the metrics that they look at. Investors buy your bonds, this is what they look at. And it kind of boils down to a few main items. Some of these are more specific to enterprise funds, so your water, wastewater. And then, obviously you have some that are more general fund. But primarily with general fund debt, especially if you're going to vote a property tax and sell a general obligation bond, you have a mill levy that's tied directly to the bond. So that's why we talk a little bit more specifically about the enterprise debt, because you just have the revenue coming in, and with that revenue, you've got to make a decision about how much debt to issue. And that revenue is there to support the payment or to make the payment on the debt service, but you can't increase the revenue beyond raising rates. And there is a level of elasticity to, consumption. So the few things that, we highlighted here in the debt and financial policies, one is what are you selling the debt for? What's the purpose? Typically it's to fund capital projects. And again, there's that point to achieve a fair balance of capital costs between the current and future customers. And then the second is getting to how much debt you have outstanding. This is a number, so, again, to use Colorado Springs Utilities as an example, they targeted 50% of their net assets, 50 to 60. We have here a target of about 50. They were, if you remember, during the period where they were issuing a lot of bonds for Southern Delivery System, they were up against the 60%. Well, as they paid that down, now they're closer to the 50% level. So that's a number that they focused a lot on. Right now, just to give you a little sense of scale, by what we can tell we have the 2018 audit, we don't have 2019 yet, but you had about 23 million of total assets in all of your enterprise funds. So I think that's, I see Denise nodding. To give you a scale of about 50%, so it'd be about half of that. And that's a target, you can go a little bit above, a little bit below. So if we're looking at your enterprise funds, about half of that is about the bond issue size, so about 12 million or so. Excuse me. And then for the general fund, since you're a home rule city, there's no limit except what you put on yourself. And again, these are targets, and the city came up with a target of about 30% of the general fund. Excuse me.
Robin, while you take a break, I'll just talk briefly about. Yeah. So the city has some financial policies. For instance, how do you do RFPs? How do you do those type of things? But it does not have some of these financial policies. And this is one of the things that Becca's been tasked to do. She has one that we've kind of put together, and we've looked at Robin, we've asked Robin to help with. And so these are some of the things that we're looking at, those financial policies. The document that we have right now is pretty long and cumbersome, and I'd like to make it simpler than just pages. So we're working on that. It's just due to time trying to get that done. So you have not seen the document yet, just because it's not ready, but these are the high levels of those documents that we would take to you, we will bring to you and get your opinion and then have you vote on it accordingly.
That's a great point. Just to back off before we leave the, since we're going to talk about the general fund later. So the maximum 30% of general fund, if you look at your 2018 expenses, that's about a bond issue of about 35 million, 30 to 40 million or so. And so that would be the maximum under this set of policies or guidelines. And again, just to reinforce, these are going to be guidelines for you. You're not going to set in stone. I mean, these are just where you're going to target when you start thinking about different ways to finance capital projects.
Robin, can I, at 35 million, we could do bonds for the general?
That's the general fund. So you had revenues in 2018 of about 10 million, expenses of about 8.6. So, you know, if you run that in a debt model of, you know, about 4% interest rate over 20 years, that's about 35, I'd call it 30 to 40 million.
Okay, I thought it was lower than that. Thank you.
Yeah. The next, and this is
Robin, sorry to interrupt you. You probably can't see everyone's picture, but I see that Councillor Wolf is trying to ask a question.
Oh,
Oh, thank you. And I hope this isn't too out of place for where you are in your presentation, but the $1.5 million that was presented at the beginning in your chart, was that just a random dollar amount, or was that dollar amount used because that's what's needed to fund something in particular?
Amy, do you want to go ahead and answer? I think
Sure. So, and I don't know if Becca wants to chime in as well, but that is what the city has identified as the immediate needs for the wastewater and water projects. Becca,
Right,
did you want to elaborate?
That's what I was going to say, that for 2020, the idea is to take care of the Clarksley and Mountain View Road water sewer lines. And so that is, they've gone out, they've had a estimate on the cost, and it was the 1.5 million, and they've got designs for that work. So that is planned for this year.
Planning
thank you.
September. Sorry.
My follow-up then is with the recent rate increase that we passed that Denise referenced earlier, I think she called it the 5-year rate case. I'm not sure if that's the rate increase, but if that is that sufficient to cover the debt service that would be under the revolving fund loan that was in your chart?
Yes, that was when we had the rate case done last year. They were given the 5-year capital improvement plan at that time to include with the cost, that modeling that they did. And this did cover the case increases that have been planned out for the next 5 years, do cover this debt that is being taken on.
Okay, thank you. That's all I have.
Thanks. That's actually a great segue to the next bullet point here. So, you know, the question is, how much debt can you issue in the enterprise funds, the water, wastewater? And how do we figure that out? Well, we start off kind of exactly to that point. We look at the revenue you have now. The city, it was very wise of you to put a 5-year rate case in place, because that lets us see where the revenue could go, you know, assuming some level of elasticity there, but not much. You know, water is an essential service, and people actually are seemingly using it a lot more these days. So we can, you know, make a conservative projection about revenue. And then we say, well, you don't want to use, for every $100 of revenue, you don't want to sell debt where you're repaying every one of those dollars, because you have to operate the system, and you want to keep some money on reserve to maintain the capital. So we use what's called a debt service coverage ratio, or sometimes it's called a fixed cost coverage ratio. And it basically says, for all, you know, if you look at your net revenues, you want to be somewhere around, at a minimum, this should be at a minimum, you know, $125 of net revenue for every $100 of payment, to up to about $150. Really, we want to see, in reality, closer to 150, 175, upwards of, you know, some of the really strong utilities that we work with try to target at least 2 times. So, you know, $2 of net revenue for every $1 of debt service payment. And then we can back into that the bond size. And so, with the 5-year rate case, and again, we haven't seen the most recent data, so this is a few months old now, without the 2019 audit, but not only can you afford the 1.5 million, but really you can afford even more than that, and upwards of, I would call it even $10 million based on what we had seen for revenue projected, current revenues and then projected revenues. So that debt service coverage ratio is a very important number. It's, again, a sort of technical one to explain and to understand, but those are the 3 big credit metrics that we look at and that really should drive some of the decisions that you make when you start thinking about debt. How much debt do you have outstanding? What's your debt service coverage? And then the next one there is how much cash do you have? So days cash on hand. The city put a number here of 90 days. Again, these are targets, but keeping cash on hand is really important. You don't want to run out of cash so that you can't operate the system.
Mm-hmm. And one of the things that we are looking at doing is long-term debt over time, but we have to get this project, and then each year as we look at those, when's the right time? And that's what Robin is on board to help us make those decisions and really be watching the market to say, now is a good time, no, let's do it this way, let's do a loan, interest rates, etc. It's really the first time that the city has looked at a more comprehensive how we're going to manage capital instead of paying it by cash. How are we going to manage it long term?
And the next few going down are start getting a little more technical. If you refund bonds, how much do you want to save? What type of debt structure do you want to sell? I would tell you, you probably want to sell fixed rate bonds, kind of like your house mortgage. You want the interest rate to be fixed. You don't want it to be fluctuating around, worried about if it goes up, if it goes down. And then we get a little more technical. I think the last bullet there is worth talking about though, and that's what we mentioned before, the general fund reserve policy. In the city, we left a blank and we talked about it with the city. And this is the unassigned fund balance. And the target that was put in here is 11 to 17% of operating expenditures. And that's a number you should probably all talk about. I think that's a really important number that you don't want to just make up. You're going to want to go back to this. This is the number that, again, if I were sitting in the shoes of a city council member, this is where I'd want to make sure I kind of know what the policy is and know what we're targeting as the budget cycle goes through, next year and then future planning. Yeah.
What's the standard or the best practices percentage? I thought I read something on CML that it was like 24% or something. Is there a rule of thumb that is a recommended amount?
GFOA, the Government Finance Officers Association, used to say to target 10%. I was looking around. It's interesting you asked that. I was looking around when we were putting this together. I don't know if that's still the standard of best practice, but for a long time that was what they target, at least 10% of operating expenditures. I would say there's so much that goes into the uniqueness of everyone's budget. I think when you've got more unpredictability about revenue streams, like we do here in Colorado, I think you do want to be a little bit on the higher side. I think when you've got a more heavily the revenue base is more heavily dominant in sales tax that is comprised not of, as Denise had said before, you can't really bank on, 10 Safeways and a King Super and a Costco and a Walmart. You've got a much more, tourism base. I think you probably want to be on the higher end. And those are, the target used to be 10%, but there's sort of the things to think about that are really more talked about, just as much. Before we move to the, planning for an election, which kind of leads into a more general fund discussion, any more questions about policy or budgeting or things to think about or anything related to these topics? All right, why don't we move on to the next slide? And I'm going to turn it back to Amy to talk about what you would do or things that you would think about in the timing of a potential election to either, one, increase revenue or, increase revenue along with a general fund type debt issuance.
Okay, great. So looking at slide 12, this is just a general timeline. So I know that the city doesn't necessarily have plans to go out for an election, but if that is something in the near future, typically we would want to start that process at least 6 months to 12 months before the November election or whenever the election is occurring. And that's really important just to make sure that the city has plenty of time to get input from the community and to really fine tune what that ballot question would look like, and to get a campaign together, as well as community members that are willing to volunteer their time to support that campaign. And so I think the main things that we would expect an election to be supporting is a property tax type debt or a sales tax type debt. So we have the calendar here that outlines all of those legal requirements. I won't get into all of those details, but there are a lot of steps that the city would have to coordinate with the county, and the city's bond counsel would assist in, as well as us, but the bond counsel firm would be drafting all of those required documents along the way. So any questions on the general timeline?
I do want to mention, if this is something that council decided that they wanted to move forward with this, we would have Robin and her group help us put this together and really look at where that would go and help with the statement. They've done this with other municipalities and school districts. It's important that you really identify what you would use the money for and how you would move forward with that. And that's ideal if we decided to do that, to help it be successful.
Yes, thank you, Denise. And there are a lot of options with, if you conduct a poll, and if you do that, we would help with all of the analysis and looking at, different debt levels and what the impact to the tax base would be, whether it was, a $5 increase per 100,000 of home, or whatever that dollar amount would be for a general obligation, property tax obligation, just as an example. But moving on, just to kind of touch on what those numbers would look like. Obviously, we are not evaluating a particular project with a dollar amount tied to it, but just to keep in mind, we did some analysis on some prospective borrowings and looking at just $1 million increment, just so that since the math is easy, you can kind of estimate if it were a $2 million project or a $5 million project. But typically, a $1 million borrowing would result in a payment or required annual repayment of approximately $70,000 to $90,000 a year. So just to keep that in mind as we continue to plan and look at what those dollar impacts would be. We also have some other statistics here just to kind of reference. So 1 mil would generate about 70,000 for a bond, and a 1 mil increase would be just over $7 for 100,000 of home value for the tax impact to the community. We also have some estimates on what a sales tax impact would be as well. So a 1% sales tax increase would generate an estimated 1.7 million of revenue. So just to kind of keep those numbers as a reference point, depending on what the city is looking at, if they are looking at a sales tax obligation or property tax obligation in the future. So Robin, I don't know if you want to elaborate on any of that, or if we want to just open up for questions.
Does anyone have questions? We can start there. The one thing I would say is why would you, well, I guess to the point of why would you do an election? If you have, so when we talked about, and the question before is, do you need to do an election? And we said, no, not for water, wastewater, enterprise fund projects. If the projects are for the general fund, so not specific to an enterprise, you have a few options. One is to take existing excess net revenues in the general fund, kind of over and above your minimum general fund balance that you're targeting. So again, important to look at that. At this point, because of the volatility of the revenue, I don't know that I would rely on, we kind of broke down the variability of the different components of the sales tax. And because they are so volatile and some of them not dependable, but there's not a lot of, there really isn't excess revenue to rely on. What that would be the only way to get around an election to finance general fund projects. You might have heard that like a lease purchase or a certificate of participation or COP. Those are common for cities and counties and even at the state level here in Colorado. It's again, Tabor requires that any annually renewing any debt that's subject to an ongoing pledge to repay bondholders goes to an election. This is a lease purchase or a COP is a 1-year payment, and then in the next year's budget you have to reappropriate the payment. So that's a way to issue essentially a long-term financing, but it's annually appropriating. So that would not require an election. Anything else, so if you're going to issue general obligation bonds, we see these a lot for school districts, you would have to raise the mill levy and then ask in the bond question for the mill levy increase and the bond, because you're subjecting the city to a multiple fiscal year obligation. That would require an election. And then sales tax, what you could do is you could vote the sales tax increase. And you have two options then. You could either vote the debt question, which makes it a sales tax revenue bond, or you can do what other municipalities do for projects, is instead of having the sales tax revenue bond, you could just vote the sales tax and have a certificate of participation. So you've got a couple of options, but really at this point, any borrowing, the bottom line is any borrowing from the general fund would likely require an election to increase the revenue stream that's coming from the general fund to repay the debt. So that's a mouthful, so I'll pause there. Any questions or anything else that we can address?
Could you explain the certificate of participation? The city has not done that before.
Sure. That's a financing instrument that is typically done for a capital asset. And I won't get too into the technical side. From the city's perspective, it is looked at as a long-term debt instrument. So technically it's not, because every year in your budget, you're going to have to make the line item for the annual appropriation. So you're going to have to appropriate that year's debt service payment. It's typically used for things like a building or something where there can be a collateral pledge. So when you sell general obligation bonds, all you're telling bondholders is that you're going to repay the money. Every year an investor is going to get a principal payment and an interest payment. For a certificate of participation or a lease purchase, an investor will also get a little bit of a lien on the property, which is different than the revenue bond does not have a lien. It's just a pledge to repay principal and interest. This does have a lien on collateral. Sometimes the collateral is what you're financing. So let's say you want to build a new police station. So the lien would be, or the mortgage would be on the police station. Sometimes it's for something totally different, which we see a lot in municipal government. So let's say you want to build, you guys live in the community, the US Olympic Committee, years ago, we did the COP for the city that was the headquarters for the USOC and the training center, but we pledged as collateral a couple fire stations and the police operations center. So there's different ways to get about leaning the collateral, but essentially from the city's perspective, you need to make sure you have enough money to repay the debt. Does that make sense?
We have 5 minutes.
Any final questions? This would be good. Anybody have a question there? And I can only see a handful of people, so I'll just call out, I guess. Mr. Shada, any questions?
No questions.
Counselor Chandler? No, okay. Counselor Wolf?
I'm all set, thank you.
Okay, great. Let's see. Mayor Pro Tem Fortune?
Bit overwhelming, but no questions at this time. Thank you.
Mr. Bremner?
No questions, thank you.
Okay, I didn't mean to overlook Susan. Susan, do you have any questions?
No,
Okay.
I don't. Great presentation. Thank you so much.
Great. And I don't have questions either. It was, I think, a very good presentation, very interesting, and a great set of slides. So, but stay tuned. Make sure we don't lose your contact information.
Yeah, please call us anytime. It is a little confusing.
May I ask a question?
Yes, we do have one following question for Counselor Wolf. Julie, you got the floor.
Thank you. So what's the next step? It sounds like now is a good time to consider borrowing and all this work is done. Are we asking staff to follow through and see if we can apply for this money, or is that
Right.
for a future agenda item, or where do we go from here?
Staff met multiple times with the Stiefel consultants and went through all our options and looked at the needs for this year and decided on the lowest interest rate with the easiest use of staff, which was the Colorado Water Resources and Power Development Authority's revolving loan, which a lot of smaller municipalities like ourselves do on a regular basis. And so we have started the process. We've turned in our loan application. We've had a pre-qualification meeting, and we have started milestone that need to be met in order to get this awarded in the fall. And in fact, on the consent calendar a month or so ago, City Council was asked to go ahead and approve some spending on this project so we could start the project ahead of time and then reimburse the city through the loans, because the water sewer funds do have the excess cash that we can use to start the projects and then reimburse with. Does that answer your question? Okay.
John, if you're are you saying me? I can't hear you.
Yeah, you had your hand up. I thought you wanted to be recognized.
Yeah, thank you. I just couldn't hear you. I just wanted to say that it helps clarify it for me. Over the past few years, and Becca helped me out here, but we have all of our capital improvements in plans now for what we want, what capital improvements we want to make in what year. So that's a huge advance that we didn't used to have. So we have a plan, and now we have to figure out how to fund that plan, and that's where the STIFL comes in, is to help us figure out how to fund these over the next few years. So I'm very enthused about the direction that we're going in. So thanks to staff and consultant for helping us move this all forward, because this is exciting. I'm sorry, it's dull as paint drying for me, but it's exciting that we're moving things forward. Thanks.
Great. Well, thank you all. Rob and Amy, thank you very much for your presentation. We'll look forward to continue to work with you and for advice. That said, I think we pretty well covered this topic. I think it's time for us to all take a break. I've got 8:09. Why don't we come back at 8:20? Does that sound good? Okay, we'll see you at 8:20. Thank you. So I think we can go ahead and resume the meeting. The next item is COVID-19 business recovery presentation. This will be by Becca Sickbert of the Manitou Springs Creative District and Leslie Lewis from the Manitou Springs Chamber of Commerce. So Judy, are they available to present here?
I'm bringing them over now, so we'll see.
Great, thanks.
Hello, everyone. Can you hear me okay?
Yes. Mm-hmm. Okay.
Okay, great. Judy, I don't know if you would be kind enough to pull up the presentation.
I'm just trying to get Leslie over here.
Becca, are we bringing Leslie over too?
Yes, please.
Okay,
She'll be
thank you.
joining me.
I'm not sure what happened. I think this happened last time. I've tried to get her over twice and now she's disappeared.
Oh, there.
Oh, there she is. Okay, good. Just took her a few seconds.
Well, great. While you're working on that, I just want to say thank you to all of you, City Council and staff, for this opportunity to spend about 30 minutes with you tonight. As a reminder, the purpose of this presentation is to provide a high-level overview of our COVID-19 economic recovery planning and current project and funding updates to City Council for awareness. I'm Becca Sickbert. I first met you on May 5th, I think. I officially started in my role, thank you, Judy, and I'm the Interim Economic Recovery Director and Executive Director at the Manitou Springs Creative District. It's actually not my first time working with the community in response to a large event. My first job out of college was working with the Kansas City community in the wake of September 9/11. So I'm happy to tap into that experience. I'm not happy that happened, but of course what we're doing is working with the community and all of our stakeholders to provide a cohesive and coordinated plan. So in March of 2020, the Manitou Springs Creative District Board voted to change their executive director with an interim 3-month focus on really looking at economic recovery in the wake of COVID-19, while also supporting the creative industries and the local arts community. And since starting in that role on May 11th, I've led our economic development efforts in close partnership with Leslie Lewis and her team at the Manitou Springs Chamber, the Visitor Center, and of course, our economic development organization here in Manitou Springs. So we look forward to having a conversation with you and listening to some of your questions tonight. So thank you for moving on to our second slide here, our contents. We'll briefly address, just a reminder, what's a creative district in the best of times? What does that mean for economic recovery focus now? We'll talk a little bit about our high-level recovery framework and start talking about those short and mid to long-term project updates. Thank you, Judy. Next slide. Okay, so you're all familiar, I imagine, with a creative district. And of course, what that means in normal circumstances is this wonderful intersection of art, innovation, and community, and really looking at how we serve economic development. And so a creative district here in the state of Colorado operates under COEDIT, the Colorado Office of Economic Development and International Trade. So really, we serve economic development and help move vital and beautiful communities forward. So here in the state of Colorado, specifically, we recognize 12 communities and neighborhoods brimming with artists, galleries, and events. And of course, not all galleries are open, not all events can happen. So what that looks like in the era of COVID-19 is that things are shifting a little bit. Despite that, we still are focused on making sure that we can attract artists, that we are empowering creative entrepreneurs, and that we're investing in a sense of innovation and really looking at how we enhance economic and civic capital. All right, next slide. Thank you. Just a quick overview. These are the creative districts currently in the state of Colorado. Manitou Springs, it will not surprise you, is special in so many ways, but one of them is that we are considered both rural and on some level urban. And so even though our population is small enough to help us qualify for some urban consideration, some rural consideration with our funding, essentially we're also urban. So in some ways we get the best of both worlds. Moving right on. Great. I wanted to give you all a sense of what really are our guiding principles as we're looking at what does economic recovery look like in the short and long term. And this framework, excuse me, I'm gonna grab a drink of water here. From the Wheeler Spring, my favorite. Okay, so this is really derived from the International Economic Development Council's framework from 2015. And that was developed in response to national disasters from natural disasters. What we're looking at is how can we apply those principles to what's happening with us and the entire global community in terms of the pandemic response. So overall, and this is very high level, what we're looking at doing is, first of all, protecting manatees' economic and public health. So everything that we talk about is looking at how we balance those two things, because it's almost impossible to talk about one without really addressing the other. And that secondly, we're looking to advance community resilience and that sense of strength, that sense of being able to adapt and pivot and diversify with high and impactful, high value initiatives. And that finally, what we're looking at doing on behalf of Manitou Springs and in partnership with the business community is looking at regional partnerships while celebrating, and this is so important, making sure that we honor Manitou Springs and the local culture and identity. So I won't go into too much detail here, because we'll be talking more about some of those projects and how they address the strategies. But certainly I did want to give you a sense of that overarching framework and what is guiding our rationale and our logic as we start to put together the projects that help move us forward. Okay, so among those projects, what we shared with you was the business impact assessment that we deployed in late May. And that again was in partnership. It was a project of the Creative District, the Chamber of Commerce, and we had input from the city staff, which have been absolutely professional and polished and excellent stewards of Manitou Springs. And so what we were able to identify when we reached out to our business community were their top concerns. And it will come as no surprise, especially in late May, that really those top three concerns were all related to what I would characterize as survival, that those business communities were concerned about cash flow. So in the survey, what we saw is that there were concerns about protecting businesses from financial loss, basically just making payroll and caring for those employees, and finally paying rent or mortgage. And then when we asked, what are your top three concerns? What we heard from our business community and our business leaders was that really what they were looking for was support to promote Manitou businesses among what we would call our near neighbors. So Colorado Springs, up the pass, along the Front Range, really looking at how do we pull people into the region who aren't necessarily having to cross state lines to make that visit. And secondly, looking at how we could really promote shop local campaigns and connect our residents with our business community. And finally, helping our business owners really understand small business grants and financing options. So we really listened to that feedback, and that helped us to guide our projects as we move forward. We'll take a look now at the resident input. Thank you, Judy. So we also reached out to our residents, because what's a community without its people? And we asked about where they were in terms of their readiness. And I should mention that our business impact survey was modeled on what we had seen from the Concord, Massachusetts community and their economic development organization. And we were really interested in what they were doing, because it was a business community that in some ways reflected some aspects of what was similar to Manitou Springs. And here for the resident impact survey, the readiness survey, I mean, we were looking at what the Boulder Downtown Partnership did to engage their residents and really listen to what were those concerns. So again, we asked a number of questions. It was a robust survey, but we were delighted to have, and I should also mention, we heard back from about 30% of our business community. And with the resident survey, we got about 4%, but that accounts to almost 250 surveys that were returned by our residents talking about what they were concerned about in regard to COVID-19. So those top 4 community concerns. And I think this really speaks to the heart and the compassion of Manitou Springs residents, that really they were looking at how could they help protect the health and safety of vulnerable populations. And so what we saw was 93% combined were either very or moderately concerned about protecting those vulnerable citizens, those vulnerable the population that might be immunocompromised or dealing with other health impacts that would make COVID-19 that much more damaging. And then secondly, we were looking at our residents being concerned about the loss of locally owned or small businesses. So certainly our residents are also concerned about our business owners in our community. And finally, the concerns I think I would characterize as basic public safety guidelines, that 84% were very or moderately concerned about people simply not keeping distance in public spaces. And additionally, that people were not wearing masks. So if 84% were concerned about social distancing, 81% were very or moderately concerned about people simply not wearing masks in public spaces. So definitely we were listening to those concerns. Let's go ahead and move on. Sorry, go back one. There we go. Okay. So in partnership with the Chamber, the Creative District, and with input from the City PIO and a working group, a task force, we assembled a campaign called Love the Town You're In. And really what we were looking at addressing were those concerns about making sure that we were encouraging people to balance both economic and public health. And so we had a number of calls to action that included thinking big by shopping small, by eating and drinking and washing your hands. Again, that we were masking for Manitou, hashtag masking for Manitou. So looking at that mask wearing piece. And finally, you may have seen the slip resistant decals that have been placed along the sidewalk in the busiest areas. And that finally encourages people to remember that distance makes our hearts grow fonder, that 6 feet of distance really does help. So that was one aspect of this multi-channel marketing campaign that you'll continue to see unfold over the course of the summer. Okay, great. So that brings us to a quick status update on where we are with our projects overall. And so looking at those short-term deliverables and projects, I'm happy to give you a quick update on some of those pieces, and that's certainly where I will be including Leslie into this conversation, and we really welcome your questions here. So I do want to mention that one of the #1 things we were looking at is how can we provide small business assistance and that access to capital, knowing that the concerns about cash flow were so very real. So our proposed approach, again, guided by the International Economic Development Council, was looking at how we could put together a virtual business recovery center. This couldn't be something physical necessarily because of the COVID restrictions, but we wanted to start to pull together resources that would support the business community. So we looked at how we could partner up to offer small business grants, and certainly the Creative District under the leadership of Natalie Johnson and many other partners, including the Community Foundation and the donors, helped to provide those gig economy workers and artists with some immediate relief. But then we were also looking at how can we support our business owners as well. So thank you to you at City Council and to everyone involved in the CARES Act funding for really looking at how we could provide reopening grant relief for those businesses. And so I would turn it over to Leslie to address where we are with that project right now.
Is Leslie still on, Judy?
Yeah, Leslie, you're muted.
Thank you. So, you all saw the application, I believe, that went out to the business community. I don't remember our exact date of getting that out now, but in the first round, we got 57 applications. So we extended our deadline a little bit and went back out to the community to businesses who had not applied. And we ended up with an additional 7 applications. So currently that application opportunity is closed at the moment. We received 64 applications, and the total that those businesses are looking for is $121,608 and change. So surprised more businesses did not respond. I specifically targeted a lot of businesses in the downtown area to find out what was going on, or why they hadn't, and I really don't have, some of them had gotten additional funding sources and didn't really need to apply for it. So that was good news. But out of the 64 that did apply, we have 16 restaurants, 35 retailers, 7 lodging properties, 3 art galleries, and 3 businesses that don't fit into those categories. So overall, some of the businesses that did apply have gotten some other funding through some other sources, but still saw this as a way to be able to still pay some of those utility bills while they were closed or as they reopened, or to provide some of the PPE supplies when they reopened, to make some of those adjustments that were needed, like the plexiglass screens. So 37 of them had gotten other funding. 27 of them had gotten no other funding through the other programs, PPP, EIDL, the EASY program that was out there. All of them are extremely grateful that council made these funds available through the CARES Act, that they could apply for them though. So now we're in the process of processing all of those applications. We hope to have the funds out on Friday to those businesses. And when they pick them up, there will be another report that they will have, that they'll have a couple of weeks to fill out and come back with their receipts. And then we'll put that into a report, provide to the city, so that the city has that, so they can provide that final report to the county.
Okay, great. Thank you for that update, Leslie. I would add, go ahead. Okay, I would add that in addition to that kind of reopening relief funding, we were looking at how we could also offer up some e-commerce readiness, operational efficiency, coaching and training, and that would be part of our next step. So certainly we'll be looking at how we stand up the rest of the virtual business recovery center with some of those resources in partnership with Exponential Impact, the SBDC, and organizations that already really look deeply at how they build organizational capacity and business excellence here within the region. And I think finally, it's really difficult to talk about economic resilience and leadership without also addressing the mental health piece. And so again, in partnership with Exponential Impact and the UCCS GRIT program through the National Institute of Human Resilience, we've been looking very closely at how we can offer up, and it will begin this week, as a matter of fact, so it's a big week, to encourage business owners and leaders across other community organizations to sign up for a peer mentoring program that allows business leaders and organizational leaders to help coach each other and provide tools and resources for mental health support, and really talking about what that looks like, because this pandemic is not over, and the ability to help each other with our own strengths, with our own resilience, and to offer up that peer support will continue to be important, we think, over the course of this recovery period. So that's what we're looking at in terms of the small business assistance and access to capital. And then we were also looking very closely at business retention, that outreach, the marketing and communications piece. And that's where we began developing that clear and consistent public health campaign. And that's something that we heard from residents. It's also something that we heard anecdotally from our business community, that one of the needs they had was for consistent messaging, because that's something that we've seen across different communities, across the entire country, that what's true for one may not be true for the other. So the extent to which we could unite that, clarify it, make sure that it was consistent is something that we can do to help our business community and certainly our residents too. And so that's really the genesis, the seed of where the Love the Town You're In campaign came from. And so we deployed that just in time for the 4th of July holiday. And that was in large part thanks to the work of the Chamber's design team. So that again was a partnership that was hugely helpful in making it happen. And also a big thanks to the Public Works Department for getting those banners hung before the onslaught of our extra visitors for the holiday weekend. So
Becca, you have 10 minutes, about 10 minutes of your 30 minutes remaining, just time hack there for you.
Yes, perfect. Thank you. We're right on track. I appreciate that. And so really what we're looking at finally, and this will come before council later, is looking potentially at how we employ some tactical urbanism in creating perhaps some temporary repurposed public spaces that could become outdoor spaces. So that will be a conversation for another time. Certainly that's in progress. And as I mentioned before, the 2 surveys that we deployed for both the business community and the residents are done. Happy to report that. And that finally, short term, we're looking at what is that infrastructure piece. So we'll have future conversations about enhanced community access to broadband. That does not mean 5G. It could be looking at other infrastructure that would allow enhanced capacity and faster speeds to help with things like video conferencing and e-commerce. Some more conversations to come. And if we could go ahead and jump into some of those more mid to long-term projects. This is where I have really good news. So I hope everyone had some coffee so you can join me in the excitement. We successfully sought and were granted funds to help support a multi-vendor marketplace for Manitou businesses. So think of this as the Etsy for Manitou Springs, and what will be baked into the DNA of this marketplace will be the requirements for collecting local sales tax. And really what we were looking at is the beginnings of laying the groundwork for a more diversified and more robust way of seeking income throughout the year, but especially during the holidays for our Manitou Springs business community, that will allow them to reach out to people who have visited from other areas, but also to residents, and make sure that we're laying that e-commerce groundwork so that there are alternative delivery mechanisms and that we can really support and engage all of our storytellers, our artists, and our creative industries in making sure that that is a more robust and long-lasting economic development piece. So I'm really happy to report we have that funded, and we'll begin working on that as soon as this week. Finally, and I think these 2 things go together, that looking at how we continue to market our businesses, those stories, what Manitou Springs has to offer that is truly unique can be both digital and in person, and that regardless of what happens next with this unfolding public health scenario, that it's important for us to help our business community have more inroads and more support and technology infrastructure to help them with their e-commerce efforts. So that's really what we're looking at with those final 2 pieces as well. And I think I would summarize the rest as saying we have some metrics for measurements and we look forward to reporting back.
Thank you. Council, do we have any quick questions for Becca? I guess there will be. Okay, Julie, okay?
Thank you. I'll make it quick. So Becca, is there like a a place on the website where businesses can get information about different loan and grant sources, or is that just done on a one-on-one basis through phone calls, or how is that done?
Well, a big part of any disaster recovery is just straight one-to-one outreach. And so I want to commend Leslie and her team for picking up the phone, for emailing, for doing that outreach. And then yes, the next step absolutely is to warehouse all of that information on the Chamber's website and to make sure that that virtual recovery center is available for our business community.
A lot of that information is already on the Chamber website, Julie, so that businesses were sent information and then we posted it so they had availability to that resource section.
That's great. And I would think that way even people not in Manitou with businesses could possibly benefit from the resources that you've identified. Okay, thank you. That's all I have.
Any other council members? Do you have questions? Okay, I don't see any hands being raised. Denise, I see you have a comment or question.
I just want to recognize both Leslie and Becca and the planning department. They and city clerk, they are working hand in hand and meeting regularly and trying to figure out how to move forward. And it's a great partnership. So I just want to recognize them for that.
Okay.
And thank you for all.
Great. Thank
and
you.
I wanted to say how excited I am to see a comprehensive data-driven plan with really solid action steps and metrics and measurements. So that if you want a way to excite me, that's how to do it. Thanks.
Welcome to the 21st century. We're getting there. Okay. Anybody else? Okay, great. Thank you. Well, we'll stay tuned. Becca, Leslie, thank you both for your presentation. We appreciate the interaction, and we'll look forward to hearing more from you in the weeks to come. Great. Thank you all.
Thank you.
Okay. The last of our discussion items this evening is the face mask requirement. See, Denise had sent out some slides this afternoon. It was kind of a scramble, I think, to collect information in this very dynamic situation. Denise, would you like to go ahead and walk us through those slides?
Sure, and I'm going to ask Chief Churchill to come over, and then Judy, do you mind pulling up the PowerPoint real quick? And while we do that, I'll just say thank you. Last Tuesday, you asked us to get this on the agenda, and so just as with everything, with the bandwidth staff, there wasn't anybody on staff that could take it. So Chief and I tried to pull together the information and give you some facts, and then we're going to ask direction of how you want to move, and we'll give you some options that you might be able to do. So please forgive, I know that you did not have the slide in your packets. I've talked about that and some of the information that Chief Churchill and his crew was able to gather over the last couple of days. So I do apologize for that, but this was just due to bandwidth. It's not something that we could take on and do as comprehensive as we would have hoped. So I just want to share that and say thank you for your flexibility as we do that. The other thing I do want to say is, as we all know, COVID-19 is hitting, I think, every community right now in every state in a way that none of us, I don't think, anticipated. I can tell you from a staff perspective, it is hitting us, and how do we deal with people being out, and how do we do teleworking and still do the amount of work that is required. So we're all working through that as we maneuver through this. There's not a playbook to follow. So that's one of the things that we're working with. So can you pull up the slide presentation? I believe that Dr. Kelly presented today to the county commissioners. If you heard that, he gave a pretty robust presentation. I was not able to listen to it, but I've looked at the website and the news to kind of get an overview of what he said. One of the things that he did say that I will start this with, and then we'll go through this, and I'm really trying to just provide facts here, but one of the things that he says is if you just say mandating, if you just mandate mask, it can create compliance. So I want to share that as we maneuver through this. The first one is just some cities and counties right now that are looking or are requiring masks. And there's a list here from, and most of them are in northern area or the southern area. The next slide. This is the slide that Councillor Chandler sent out today that is on the website, and it talks about the counties that are mandating it and then some cities that are mandating. So it gives you an overview of that and kind of where it's at within the state of Colorado. I believe the state of Texas just did a mandate a couple of days ago also, and along with some other states. Next slide. There are a couple that have opted out, and this penalties changed, and you saw that by the information that I sent out, but I wasn't able to get it done. Douglas County, even though their health department is mandating it, my understanding is right now they are opting out. Penalties range from $15 to like $5,000. So we'll talk a little bit about that. Numerous cities are doing resolutions with no penalties. Others are doing ordinances with penalties. Next slide. So this is some information that we sent out today that we were able and it's really Chief Churchill and his group that were able to contact the different communities and especially the police departments and ask what they were doing and how they were doing it. So it tells you the different fines that they have, and some of them are saying that the businesses, if they don't comply, they may shut down, but we'll just go through this. I don't need to read it. You guys received this afternoon in an email also. Next slide. Again, some additional information on the cities and what some different cities and what they're doing. The age requirement, as you can see, ranges from 2 years. I think one of them even required newborns up to starting at 10 years of age. So the age requirement of when a mask is required is one of the things that is pretty all over. Go ahead. Again, just some additional information that you guys received this afternoon. Next one. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Chief Churchill to talk a little bit about enforcement and what he's learned from the different police, chief of police throughout the region and throughout the ones that they interviewed. So Chief, I'll go ahead and send it over to you.
Thank you, Denise. Good night, good evening, everybody. I spent the last several days talking to a lot of law enforcement leaders, community leaders around the state of Colorado that have implemented mask ordinances, and I've found a few lessons learned, some statistics, and a couple of recommendations from them. A lot of this information was sent to council this afternoon in an email, and I could go through some of it real quick with you. And if there's any questions you have at any time, please interrupt and go ahead and ask. For the most part, almost to a city, the style of enforcement has been, and this is real world on the ground actually implementing the law, has been for the mask mandate to be required inside restaurants, businesses, and public facilities. There's no mask ordinance for public street walking. The ordinances basically kick in once you get in line to go inside a business, to go inside a restaurant, or to a public facility. How most towns are handling it are through marketing, through education, and then finally through code enforcement. So if the city has a mask ordinance, how they go about enforcing it, one is through signage. Each business that falls under the mask ordinance has to have signage on their premises that states in order to enter this premises, you must have a mask on. It is then on the business itself to enforce that policy. Then two things can happen. If the business is not enforcing the policy, if they are allowing people to to come in without mask, if they are not following the social distancing mandates or the local public health order, then a call can be made, and depends on where you're at. A call can be made to the city that goes to code enforcement, who then goes down and seeks to educate, notify, and then finally, if necessary, fine the business. The police come into play when a business has a patron that has come inside and refuses to put the mask on, then just creates a disturbance and refuses to leave. At that time, people call 911 and the police show up. That's what I found in all my discussions to be how people are actually operating the law and what seems to be working the most. Of 14 agencies we've contacted, only one, the City of Boulder, has issued any type of citation or fine. None of the other 13 have been able to say that there's been a single citation written. Almost to an agency, each of the chiefs of police or the individuals that spoke for the chief that I talked to have said where they would redo things is on the heavy-handed misdemeanor offenses. The 1 year in jail, the $5,000 fine, the mandatory court appearances are things that they would not do again. They said that's what's caused the most grief, the most anger, and the most calls and emails about being too government heavy-handed. What they say seems to be most effective is a situation where it's down to the $15 or $20 infraction ticket. Inglewood said that to me, that that seems to have not caused the most drama while getting the most compliance. Even though they've yet to write a single one, the threat of the $20 ticket has been enough. The second and third order of effects are most of our people are from out of town. If you hit them with a misdemeanor offense or even a ticket and it's too heavy to pay, then they've got to, and they don't pay, they either come back to court or they just go back home and it never gets paid or resolved anyway. Do we have any questions to this point?
Chief, do you want to just briefly talk about if you, with the new law as police officers, if you go out and talk to somebody about this, what that entails and the time it takes?
That's when it comes to enforcement. If you're utilizing police officers, and I haven't found a department yet that has said, other than I think Breckenridge, that has said they're actively using police officers to patrol and to engage people when it comes to wearing masks. With the new SB 217 law, anytime a police officer contacts or engages a citizen in a law enforcement capacity, not only now are we going to be dealing with that issue or writing that citation or that summons, but we also have to do a 17 data point report to comply with the new law. So if I were to walk up to a citizen on the sidewalk and engage them on not wearing a mask, that time would be taken. I would also then have to go back to the police station and do the Senate Bill 217 report. So all in all, one person contact, probably 20 to 30 minutes for one officer for one talking to one person. That's just one of the difficulties in utilizing the police. And then for Manitou, most of the time, we only have 2 police officers working actively to patrol the entire city. So it's just it's a consideration. I think what is effective, and this is from people that I've talked to that are actually doing it, is utilizing a marketing campaign, educating people, telling them that a mask is required. We can even engage other departments within the city, Department of Public Works, if we desire to help inform people and hand out masks as they saw necessary. But what's been effective has been the signage in businesses. You can't come into a business. You can't come into a restaurant. You can't shop if you don't have a mask on. And that is been self-enforced by the business owners with a lot of success. Eventually, and most agencies have told me within a short amount of time that attitude of needing to wear a mask kicks in and people start complying. I think with the last presentation we got on marketing and how we market to tourists, if we start actively and proactively marketing that you have to have a mask to come here, that will get a lot of compliance through that.
I want to give a 12-minute hack here.
Okay, let's go to the next one real quick. Thank you, Chief. Anything else that, Chief, you want to add real quick?
I think we can be successful with this. I tell you, I'm sure council has heard from our citizens as well as I have, as well as a survey of 84% for distance and 81% of our citizens in Manitou are concerned about mask and distancing. I think this is important for our town, something we have to be proactive about. But if we implement something like this, I want it to be effective. I want it to be successful. And I want us to present a good image as a community as we move forward with this.
Great, thank you. So the next slide is really some of those options. Is a no mask requirement in continuing education, a mask requirement, and I think with an educational component. And that can be done in several ways. You can do this, I have the authority, the mayor has the authority, if you gave direction, whatever, to say under the emergency order that you want this in place starting whatever. Or we can come back at the next Tuesday and do a resolution or ordinance. I reached out to Jeff Parker. He says either one is okay in this, since it would be under the emergency order if we put it under that. So it could go either way. If you did a resolution, it would be only one reading. If you do an ordinance, you have to do 2 readings. Some of the things that we would need to look at is what are those exceptions? And I've looked at several ordinances or resolutions that's been done by other cities, and these are kind of the things that they've looked at as those exceptions, and then that age requirement, what that would look like. Next slide. So again, this is the resolution versus ordinance. I was asked to kind of explain that, but again, Jeff Parker says because of the city emergency powers, we can do either one, and it's really up to you and the direction that you provide. Again, you asked us to get this together. I put together this fairly quickly, tried to give as much information as we could, did some research, and now I'm asking from you direction of how you want us to move forward. And if you want us to do it under the emergency order, if you want a resolution, if you want an ordinance, or do you not want to do it? So I would turn it back over to you.
Thank you, Denise. So I don't want to belabor this too much this evening if we can help it, but I think perhaps the appropriate thing is to just go around the table and get a quick temperature reading on, from council members, if we could do that kind of quickly. I have a draft, the copy of the Colorado Springs ordinance that they had anticipated acting on this week, and I guess they pulled it off. My understanding is they pulled off their agenda yesterday. So anyway, okay, Councilor Chandler, can we start with you? Just real quick, give us your thoughts.
I support a mask mandate. I support that in the form of a resolution. I do believe that council has gotten clear direction from the residents of Manitou who have chosen to speak up that this is a very important issue and they want us to take action.
Thank you. Councilor Shada?
I agree with Judith. I believe that there should be signage at every single parking kiosk that says masks are required. I think that's one of the first points in which our visitors are interfacing with our community. And I don't think it should be hard to kind of maybe have some of those little realtor boxes with some masks along the side so that people can get one out of there if they need one.
Okay, great, thank you. Councilor Bremner?
Yeah, I'm in agreement with a mask ordinance. We have a lot of tourists coming in from Texas and Arizona and all kinds of other states that have high levels of COVID-19, and I think it's important to protect our citizens. I'm more in favor of a lower fine, such as Boulder has, $50 maybe for the first offense, and then not necessarily even enforcing it, but just having it as an option.
Okay, great, thank you.
Also, may I ask, did you want an ordinance or a resolution? Because that really changes if it's a first and second reading or if it's just a one.
Right, okay, so.
I would go along with what Judith said.
The resolution. Okay, thank you.
So, Mr. Bremer, you favor a resolution. Councilor Chandler, a resolution. Councilor Shada, were you in favor of resolution or ordinance?
Yes, sir.
I'm sorry, I didn't catch all that, John.
Yes, yes, a resolution.
Resolution, okay. Councilor Wolf, what are your thoughts?
I agree. I'm also in favor of a resolution. I get a lot of feedback from locals who won't go downtown because people don't wear masks. I'm way too afraid to go downtown with no masks. I did notice that the Colorado Springs ordinance had a funny little sentence in there where they prohibited anyone, or I should say, they considered the mask to be unacceptable, and you would still be considered unmasked unless the mask itself is washable. And I thought that was surprising because the so-called surgical masks, which are, in my personal experience, the easiest things to breathe through, they're so light, but they have that important filter in the middle that stops germs, most germs from spreading in or out. And then, but those are not washable. And then I also looked up on the, I don't know if it was the CDC guidelines or maybe it was johnhopkins.org, you know, the hospital system, but one of those places said that they highly recommend the paper surgical masks as being more effective than the cotton masks. So if we're going to copy some of the wording from the Colorado Springs draft ordinance that we saw, I would suggest that we leave out that part about the mask has to be washable or it doesn't count.
Mm-hmm.
So, Councilor Wolbrook, did you just say I support it, or?
No,
or did you,
I didn't hear you. You cut out. My apologies.
I'm sorry, my apologies.
No, it's okay. So as of tonight, everyone's deferred on a mandatory mask mandate from this point of the view of the city of Colorado Springs, El Paso County today, if you watch their hearing, which you can also find online. Even the governor tonight was asked if he would do it and he didn't do it. I think this has a lot to do with the complications of enforcement, mandating a mask, but I think Councilor Wolf brings up an excellent question. What kind of mask? Sounds like a face covering. So I think that, you know, there's going to be, if we do this and we do put signage in the parking lots, which I agree with Councilor Shada would probably be a good idea. Does that cost come out of the CARES Act? I guess if you're a business, you just make a sign on a sheet of paper, and that doesn't, there's no sign ordinance in Manitou Springs that's in our code that would impact what kind of sign you use for this. That's a question that I have. My preference would be, I felt like after watching the county presentation today, they were very close to mandating masks. And in this whole COVID situation, we've taken a lot of guidance from the county because that is the health department. We don't have our own health department. And I would prefer that whatever we do match what the county does, maybe even more so than the state or Colorado Springs, because that's the health department that we use. I have serious concerns about passing a law that won't be enforced. We have a lot of laws that we don't enforce in Manitou. This would be, in my opinion, another one. So that is something that I still don't like. I understand that businesses, I've heard loud and clear, that businesses want us to make this mandatory so they can say to their customer, it's the law, you have to do it. But then we don't have any teeth in that law. And I don't know that our citizens are going to be really happy with us when we can't follow up with that. It may be that all the things that people say about compliance just falls into place when you make it a law. Maybe, maybe not. The governor tonight in his press conference did not really indicate that he had full confidence in that theory. So I feel like since everyone's deferred this week, we need to wait and watch, especially what the county does. And if the county goes with a mandate, let's make it simple on our staff. do what the county's doing, it's also clear, I think, for people when we do things one way. So that's where I'm at with it. Thank you.
Thank you. Mayor Pro Tem. Nancy, you're muted.
Yeah, I got sucked into that. Okay, I'm just reading on my news feed that El Paso County faces a shutdown within 2 weeks if the corona cases continue to rise. I think our community has spoken very loudly and very clearly that we must put a mask mandate in place. I would like to see us do that much sooner rather than later, and hence I would prefer to have it as part of our emergency declaration that the mayor and the city administrator can craft and put in place, again, sooner rather than later. I would prefer at this point. Earlier I thought, oh, we'll wait a week. Well, I'm not even, the science is just becoming overwhelming that masks are important. I would rather get it in place than have it 100%. I know that it won't be perfect. As I've said before, there's no way 7 people can wordsmith a document and get it done soon. So I trust the mayor and the city administrator with assistance from the chief to put something together. So I would put it under the emergency declaration and get it done. That's my opinion. Thank you.
And I guess my opinion also would be, I would certainly be willing to collaborate with Denise and the police chief to get an emergency ordinance ready as soon as possible. I'm thinking like tomorrow.
Not an ordinance, John.
Or excuse me, a resolution.
Would just be under emergency order.
My bad. You can see I didn't go to law school, but I think there's a matter of urgency. I do think that as conditions change, and I expect they will change, we could revisit this with a little bit of time and craft an ordinance which maybe would fall in line with the county, depending on what they're going to do. But we thought yesterday the city of Colorado Springs would do something, and they did not. I find it somewhat ironic that a Texas resident who doesn't want to wear a mask, now that masks are required there, can come to Colorado on vacation and not wear a mask. And they're the ones with the more severe infection rates and spiking rates. I shouldn't just pick on Texas, but I think we do need to protect our population, and certainly they've spoken as loudly and cohesively as I think Manitou has done in quite a long time. So I would be in favor, certainly, of drafting an emergency resolution tomorrow, if that would be okay with majority of council. I see it a couple. Julie?
Thank you. I just wanted to mention that since we got that statistic tonight about, I think it was 81% of the respondents to the survey indicated that they were either moderately or very worried about the lack of masks in town. I don't know if that would be one of the whereases in your resolution drafting, but just to recognize that although we on council may have different personal views, we've had this survey done and we're having an overwhelming majority of folks wanting us to do this. It's just a suggestion. Thank you.
Okay, that's a good point. Okay, if I may, Councillor Chandler.
I just wanted to say that I was looking for an article that I had sent to Councillor Shada. I was going to send it to you in real time, and it was an interesting research article on if nationwide we mandated masks in each state and we only had 15% compliance per state, we would save $1.4 trillion in medical expenses. So I don't think we should follow El Paso County. They are in second place next to Denver County. The cases in El Paso County are escalating rapidly. And I just want to share something that happened to me today. I was in a salon today, and it took everything I could do to go to get my hair done. I hadn't been in a salon since February, and I was in that salon on West Colorado Avenue for 1 hour. And in that 1 hour, there were 2 mask-related incidences where the salon individuals were accosted by 2 individuals that came in demanding an appointment without masks. And I just watched it happen in real time. And I do really feel the need to make a stand, to respect the input from our residences, and make this mandatory, with 84 and 81% people responding in that survey to the mask and social distancing requests. And so I totally agree and support an emergency resolution ASAP.
Okay, so it looks like we have a majority here that's agreed to go with a resolution. I guess the question now is, do we want the emergency resolution that Denise and I would prepare tomorrow, or do we want to wait till next Tuesday? Mr. Shada?
If we can do it quicker, I would back off my resolution and say, let's get it done.
Okay, so to cut to the quick here, I'm going to ask you to vote to see who's in favor of having Denise and me do an emergency resolution tomorrow. All in favor of that, if you'll show of hands. Okay, let's see. All right, so we got 6 there. Okay, and all opposed. Okay, we have Councilor Wilbrook. Okay, so the direction from council then is to authorize or to request that Denise and I prepare an emergency resolution tomorrow.
Ask a question on that, John?
Yeah, but just a question, and that would be in conjunction with input from Chief Churchill also.
And with Jeff Parker. Jeff Parker would be the one that would really write it, and we would just give him the details.
Good point. Okay, Julie?
Oh, I just wanted to know, with your resolution, do you have any thoughts about what you'll say in the sentence that says when this becomes effective?
I think the typical approach on the emergency resolution is immediately. I believe, does that sound consistent with your expectation, Denise? You're muted, Denise. Denise, you're muted.
Sorry. I would say it would probably be not tomorrow, but the next day. We have to get Jeff Parker to help us write it. We'll have to go there. But as soon as we get it written and go, then and the city clerk signs off, then it goes into effect immediately.
We're at 30 minutes of our 15-minute time frame.
Good point. I think with that, I think we have direction on that, and we will declare item 5 taken care of. Let's move into council correspondence, please. Do we have anyone who'd like to kick off? Councilor Chandler?
Sure. First of all, I'd like to thank all of the people that continue to let us know how they feel about the incline, and to just let everyone know we're still working on that diligently. Appreciate everyone who sent or called. I had lots of phone calls about the mask mandate, so thank you to all the residents who reached out. I just want to do a specific shout out to the individual. I want our paramedic, who I have his name written down, who on May 25th, Jeremy, on May 25th, I won't say his last name because I'll screw it up, helped resuscitate an infant and helped save the life of a little baby. So a shout out to the paramedic who did that. Kudos to you. And lastly, I'm excited to attend the upcoming OSAC meeting on Monday the 27th. It looks like we'll be looking at talking about possibly connecting a trail to Waldo Canyon through the Black Canyon open space. So look forward to that discussion. That's all I have. Thank you.
Jada, how about you? John, do you have anything?
No, I don't. Sure.
Okay, all righty. Councilor Wolf?
Just a couple little things. I got a call from someone wanting to know if I had any idea why the Jenkins property is all fenced off. I said, I don't know. So I don't know if anybody knows the answer to that. I didn't know.
We don't know the answer. I have received a couple of emails asking the same thing, so we're kind of.
Oh, okay. And then I know this isn't really within the jurisdiction of Manitou, but I did get a very upset text message from someone who witnessed the bear who attacked the lady and scratched her back. This person happened to be watching as the police or as the whoever they were, the Department of Wildlife or whoever took care of that, the way they euthanized the mother bear and then took away her 2 baby cubs. And this person thought Manitou should have handled it much more understandably and been willing to relocate the bear. And I explained that Manitou had no rights to even give input on that situation as I understood it. And then just, random text messages complaining about lack of masks. And I think an email from someone who actually doesn't live in Manitou, who's a friend of mine, who said that she came to Manitou and then promptly left because she didn't feel safe since the mask usage was about 5%. And I think that's all I have.
Thank you. Steve, you got anything?
Yeah, regarding the Jenkins property, I've been corresponding with Ken Giray and Michael Mayo about that. We were also curious about that. It actually is, there was a railroad right-of-way through there, and it's a trail connecting Rattlesnake Gulch over to Mesa Avenue. And so, I mean, neighbors were using it. Local people were using that trail quite a bit. And he has padlocked it off pretty heavily and put barbed wire up there. So it's a question, and we're trying to figure out what's going on. That's all.
Thanks. Keep us advised, please. Very good. Mayor Pro Tem Fortune?
Nothing, thank you.
Okay, thank you. Councilor Wilbrook?
I have nothing, thank you.
Okay. And mine was pretty much more of the same, emails from and correspondence and phone calls from mostly, it seems like Manitou residents this week concerned about masks. So that was the principal thing. And I will leave it to Denise with the city administrator's report. We did meet with John Southers and Jeff Green, and she can perhaps, I think she sent an email on. That's probably about all we want to go into on that. Okay, city administrator's report, Mr. Cheney.
Yeah, just we did trim the trees on Duclos. We are working on getting the pool open maybe next week. And we did some street striping on Crystal Hills. And the parking logics equipment should be in by the end of the week. And then we'll look at trying to get that installed as soon as possible. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. And Denise, I'm sorry.
I'll try to keep it short, but all the department heads and Becca and myself have been working diligently on the amended budget, especially with us bringing parking in-house. So that is taking quite a bit of time to do that in that transition. It's time of the year to look at benefits for next year. So we're looking at that for the employees, which is also taking time in next year's budget. We've started that process in department heads. So lots of time on budgets, monitoring budgets, how much is coming in, where our revenue is, all of those things is taking a tremendous amount of time right now. And then of course we did the mask. And the one thing I can say with COVID-19 is as I said before, is it's impacting the workload that we are taking on, and it's also impacting our bandwidth. If somebody's exposed and they go home for 14 days and is quarantined, we don't have a lot of people, we don't have a lot of bandwidth where we have 3 other people that do that same job. So just know that staff is stretched, and recognition and kudos and understanding is very important right now. It's a very tough time on staff. Oh, and the other thing I do want to mention, you may have seen that there was the imposter page has some things, and it was put on Twitter. I have Alex and some people working on that. We're trying to take some action fairly quickly. Don't know what we can do yet, but just know that we are working on it. And we had 9 News follow up with us today about something that was posted, and we explained that that was not us. So we're trying to manage it as quickly as we can. I just share that with you.
Great, thank you. I think we've covered everything we expected to do. Julie,
Thank you. I just wanted to say that I think it's fabulous that, and it seemed like a lot of work this past week, but I think it's great, John Mayer, that you're responding to all of those emails that we get. I thought they were very diplomatic and encouraging, and I just wanted to thank you. I thought that was a really good job, and you sure had a lot of them this past week. But I read all of your responses. I thought they were great.
well, then in that case, we'll end on a happy note and we will go ahead and adjourn. Thanks for your time, everybody. Get good night's rest.
Thank you. Good night.